Welcome, wrestling fans, to the Pro Wrestle Machine. Whether you're tuning in from the Great American Bash or halfway around the world, we've got a jam-packed episode for you. Get ready to dive into wrestling's rich history, packed with insights, opinions, and a few surprises. And remember, you can skip to your favorite moments with our chapter markers. Let's jump right into it. December 12, 1999 Observer Newsletter. WWF slightly tones down product, Vince Russo appears on Wrestling Observer Live. By Dave Meltzer. After a week of bad publicity which sent sponsors running and sent its stock plummeting, kinder, gentler WWF came back with a toned-down SmackDown, and a slightly toned-down, although you'd have to examine too closely to notice, Raw show. Exactly what this means for the long run is more uncertain. After getting as low as 14 13/16 on the morning of December 7th, the stock, artificially low due to the bad publicity, returned to just below the bottom of the former normal levels, closing at press time at 19 January 2nd. The only sponsor that has returned to this point after the toned-down SmackDown was Burger King, but nobody really expected sponsors to come back for a few weeks. L. Brent Bozell, whose writings on behalf of the Parents Television Council led to numerous sponsorship drops on SmackDown, a few of which remained buying the rest of the cable package and a few of which pulled out in entirety. SmackDown, still rated TV-14 although WWF statements claimed it would be TV-PG, featured far less women in skimpy outfits, less questionable language but generally speaking was as entertaining, if not more than it usually had been. There were changes promised with Raw as well. According to WWF sources, eventually the two products will be similar and eventually Raw may carry a TV-PG rating, with the feeling it's better to be safe than to go through this publicity again. However, many in the TV world noted Jerry Springer, who used shock TV to get ahead in the talk show game like WWF did in the wrestling game, and when he toned down, his ratings toned down, and when the bad publicity faded and the media moved on to new subjects, he went right back to the successful product that made him, until bad publicity forced him to tone down again. There were a few minor changes that few would notice. The sign guy character that as late as last week was said to have been given a much bigger role in storylines, meant to portray and mock L. Brent Bozell 3, was dropped without a mention. The women characters were dressed sexy, but not quite as skimpy as before, but you have to look hard to actually notice slightly more clothes on Terry, Tori, Ivory and the Hose. There were several bleeps during Triple H's interview, but it almost seemed as if they were a parody, as Helmsley kept using the words slut and whore followed by a bleep rather than the words themselves being bleeped. They are still doing a clothes-ripping match on the December 12th pay-per-view, although standards for pay-per-view should be different than broadcast TV because nobody can watch a pay-per-view by accident. WWF hasn't released any more press releases like the stupid one criticizing Coca-Cola for pulling out, which only made them more enemies in that world for no reason. At the same time, Bozell, who had promised to cover SmackDown in its toned-down form, had written nothing about the toned-down show at press time. On Raw on December 6th, Road Dogg's catchphrase was slightly altered and will be changed. No more shiznit or doggy style, although his opening the show and changing words slightly was almost to make a mockery of the fact he had to change. The Godfather's catchphrase also very slightly changed, although all the pimp and hoe references remain, but the reference to smoking dope were dropped. Val Venus was attacked while attempting to deliver his catchphrase, and we're told, and please be skeptical of all of this, particularly if bad publicity fades away, that he'll be dropping the trademark open and no longer be referred to as a porn star or ex-porn star. Godfather and Venus were both kept off SmackDown on December 2nd and Godfather also didn't appear on December 9th. Venus appeared on that show, but only in run-in form. Bozell wrote this past week that Mr. McMahon's characterization of his wrestling shows is more fictitious than the shows themselves. There's no rape, robbery, murder or attempt at any of those things in anything we do. We're fun, he says in a recent article. In fact, on SmackDown there have been either portrayals of or allusions to rape, bestiality, incest, homosexuality, nudity, and prostitution. The show's sexual elements are mixed liberally with extreme brutality. Characters routinely use weapons such as sledgehammers, pipes, chains, and occasionally vehicles on each other. Matches have involved men trying to light one another on fire and women pulling each other's tops off. The scorecard at press time of who dropped out, and because of it being Christmas season, the WWF was able to get new advertisers to fill the spot, so except for the stock price falling, there was really no short-term economic losses sustained from all this, where the Army, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, Coca-Cola, Mars Incorporated, and N&T reports of Wendy's, Ford, General Motors and Domino's Pizza pulling out in different places were untrue as none were sponsors to begin with. In the most newsworthy segment in the short history of Wrestling Observer Live, Vince Russo said that Nitro would go from 8 to 10 p.m. starting the first of the year. Russo said he was vehemently against that move. It was a decision by Brad Siegel, who oversees WCW for Time Warner, with the belief TNT has stronger programming to fit the 10 and 11 p.m. slot than the 8 and 9 p.m. slot, wanting it from 9 to 11 p.m. both so the show would be able to get more risque and be TV-14. It was going to be kept TV PG, however, due to the pressures due to the media stories on wrestling, was changed out of caution to TV-14 even with no change in content, and also so they wouldn't hand WWF a gigantic audience during the 10 to 11 p.m. hour. In January, with the combination of the NFL season ending and an unopposed second hour, Raw's 5.5 to 6.5 ratings range currently should increase to a 6.8 to 7.8 range over the 2 hours being averaged given no increase in real interest in the product. I'd say a 7.3 rating in January would be equivalent to the current 5.8 average, which means the WWF is going to be headed for a perceived huge business boom without really doing anything. It also should be noted that this will almost surely make the 10 and 11 p.m. hour by far the most viewed hour of wrestling by those under 11, while at the same time it'll be pushed as the most risque because it's the late hour. For Nitro, the rating by eliminating the third hour will artificially increase from the current 3.2 to probably a 3.6 or 3.7 with no actual increase in company popularity due to NFL season ending and the third hour that dragged down the overall number eliminated. For WCW to come out ahead advertising revenue-wise by eliminating the third hour, the number has to jump from a 3.2 to a 4.8, and we know that isn't happening unless things legitimately as opposed to artificially are turned around. For TNT as a station to come out ahead ad revenue-wise by dropping the third hour, the 2-hour average will have to increase to about a 4.1, which is possible but would require more than an artificial increase. Anyway, because of this time slot change, people will be able to manipulate the numbers to indicate a huge increase in popularity of pro wrestling in the year 2000 as Raw's ratings are going up 26% artificially in January and Nitro's are going up 16% artificially, by eliminating the third hour that was dragging down the overall average at the same time. What that means is, WWF isn't going to have any trouble getting advertisers for Raw next year, and the ratings will probably sway a lot of defecting advertisers back, particularly if the media heat doesn't continue. The company will also be able to charge appreciably more for ad rates. In other words, with no real increase in popularity, the company will be considerably upping its ad revenue and look to the outside like they are booming. So get the stock now before everyone figures this out. Thunder will be from 9 to 11 p.m. on Wednesdays, but won't be more risque as due to sponsor pressure. With Thunder moving to Wednesday, both WCW and WWF should increase ratings for Thunder and SmackDown based on each show going unopposed, which again will give the appearance of rising ratings of each show. Starting with the taping on December 7th, basically all the stars will be coming to Thunder as scheduled for the Madison, Wisconsin taping included Goldberg, Piper, Hart, Sting, Hall, and Nash, most of whom never worked Thunder. It may not be until February when the WCW Saturday night matches will be taped at the Thunder tapings. At this point it looks like they are doing Saturday night tapings on January 5th in Rock Hill, South Carolina and January 19th in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. There are Saturday night tapings actually on the schedule through March, but the belief is at that point is these will be the last ones. The WCW TV title is being dropped with a storyline being the angle on the November 29th Nitro where Kevin Nash threw Scott Hall's belt in the garbage can. Since it, like every other title in this company, have been positioned in a way that they mean nothing, it's not important one way or the other. They had a 31-match tournament for the world title and with the exception of Benoit's matches, none of the matches were any good, none were memorable, virtually every match had outside interference or was so short it had no impact, and nobody considers Hart any bigger of a star after winning in Toronto than he was the week before. The situation with Jushin Liger and the IWGP Junior title seems to be this. Liger and New Japan booked him into WCW. It was a decision forced on Russo and not one that he particularly wanted. The deal was that Liger would lose the title on Nitro, then win it back on Nitro the following week. I'm only guessing this part, but apparently the idea was for Liger to work that program with Mysterio Jr. when he got there. Of course, Mysterio Jr. wasn't there, so Guerrero was made his opponent. While Mysterio Jr. in his few matches in Japan got tremendous media exposure, and is something of a name attraction in Japan, Guerrero's name is known really only to the hardcore fans, and to the fans who watch Nitro, a very small hardcore minority. He's a jobber who gets no push. Liger claimed to have lost the title belt, which is why he didn't bring it to the ring. There is controversy, and this is why Guerrero was so mad doing the commentary on Liger's match on Thunder, over the injury. Guerrero feels it was Liger's mistake, and feels it was on purpose because he wasn't professional and didn't respect him by bringing the belt out, and that Liger intentionally sidestepped catching him on the springboard plancha, which caused him to land on his elbow and break his arm, where it needs surgery. I had already sent my tape of the show out before hearing this story, but from people who watched it, it wasn't as if Liger sidestepped away, but Guerrero's direction coming off the ropes was too far to the left. Liger stuck his arm out but didn't appear to make a great effort to catch Guerrero. Guerrero landed full force and Liger didn't break his fall. It's hard to say it was Liger's fault because he did stick his arms out like he was attempting to catch him, but it looked as though he could have made a better attempt. Liger could have also been mad, not at the finish with Guerrero, but with the black eye the setting was going to give the belt, which means something in Japan, and the fact the Nitro match would air to the hardcores in Japan on satellite. Basically the 5 minutes match, the tequila bottle finish and buzzkill distracting leading to it. The fact the match itself was just background to Brad Armstrong getting a new lame character over. It's the basic problem that goes both ways in New Japan and WCW relations because neither side has any understanding of the other. A few years back, when Kensuke Sasaki held the US title and WCW wanted him to drop it to one-man Gang, that whole scenario was a total embarrassment because Gang wasn't the level of wrestler that Sasaki should lose to based on Japan where wins and losses are taken seriously. So they did a match where Sasaki lost by a gimmick, it was restarted, and Sasaki pinned him. On American TV, they only showed the first finish and acknowledged it as a title change. In Japan, the claim was Sasaki gave back the belt after the Gang match. WCW guys were mad when New Japan had a tournament and Sting was asked to job Toshiro Koshinaka, who at the time was a pretty big star, while Sasaki came back and wouldn't do a clean job to Hugh Morris, who wasn't nearly as big a star, but the people in WCW didn't know that because Koshinaka had no name in the US and doesn't have a great body on Nitro. If, in the American system, that wins and losses mean nothing, especially if they take place in Japan, why did WCW not allow Goldberg to wrestle a Japanese guy, and you know they'd never let Goldberg go over there and lose, and WWF has made it clear that none of its top guys are going to lose to a Japanese wrestler if any deal is made with any Japanese company. Due to the pressure that sponsors have put on WWF to clean up, many of the sponsors that have pulled out of WWF and stayed with WCW have started putting pressure on it to clean up as well. Russo noted that station management, in particular standards and practices, forced them to drop the Bell's palsy part of the portrayal of Oklahoma due to the station getting negative response from viewers. He portrayed that as probably just a few letters, and insinuated some may have come from friends of Ross. The basic story of the November 29th Nitro angle where Oklahoma had the barbecue sauce poured on his face by the Misfits and Vampiro was from a storyline standpoint to portray it as unfreezing Oklahoma's face, so from a storyline reason there is no portrayal of Bell's palsy in the character anymore. Ferrara was telling people that they forced him to change because of 2 complaining letters, while Russo on Observer Live said it was maybe 5 letters and said they were probably from Ross friends. We got dozens of very negative emails, several letters and close to 24 phone calls, most of them seething, after the first time the character aired. Somehow I think if people would call here to complain, that many times that number would likely call the station, although that isn't necessarily the case, but probably also should tell people who call here to complain about things that if they were to memo the people in charge of the company, then the company may be responsive to them. Russo also said that on the show standards and practices wouldn't allow Piper to make any remarks about Rhonda Singh being fat because they were afraid of complaints from overweight women, and claimed because of Coca-Cola being sponsors and putting pressure on in media coverage of WWF that week that standards and practices on November 29th was in a panic mood. He said that in the WWF when he was there was always heat with sponsors, with the exception of Wrigley's. Nobody major pulled out until recent weeks, but the feeling was as long as they delivered the ratings, the sponsors would stay with them. He said WWF had to be shock TV, which WCW doesn't have to be, because they had to overcome the fact they didn't have the talent depth. On the subject of blood, Russo said at the Havoc show, they went to Siegel and basically begged him to allow them use of blood for Sid Vicious because it was important for the long-term portrayal of Sid, basically copying the Austin/Bret Hart WrestleMania double turn angle where blood was so important in getting Vicious not quitting over as a babyface turn. He said then Flair in the very next match went into business for himself and got tons of blood in the match with Page, which brought down tremendous heat on the company. Vampiro on the Mayhem pay-per-view wanted to juice heavy in the chain match with Berlin, but the feeling was they at that point didn't want any juice on a show, at least unless it's in a situation where it's important enough to make a presentation to Time Warner management beforehand to get it cleared. Russo said that he didn't know the particulars of D'Lo Brown's contract, and that he's heard it had 18 months to go from one source, which Jim Ross has stated at least twice on his website report. but also heard there may be an option in January but isn't sure whose option that would be. In WWF contracts, generally speaking, the option is that the WWF has the power to renew the contract if it chooses, as a lot of contracts are 3 years with a 2-year option, which means WWF can dump the contract after 3 years, but if they want to keep the guy, they have the power to renew him without the person having the power to shop themselves around, or which story is true. I think he may know the particulars. He mentioned Brown as someone he'd be very interested in if he was available, and said he'd be interested in a lot of WWF mid-carders, saying that McMahon only really is concerned about the top 5 guys in their programs, and with him gone a lot of the mid-card guys would flounder, and mentioned Test, Christian and Edge in particular. When asked about Steve Regal, he called him a talented worker, but very boring in that he needed to get his character up to speed. He said he'd jump at the chance to get Shawn Michaels if he was available. He said Michaels is very difficult to deal with but is one of the 3 most talented people of this era. He said nobody intimidated McMahon's talent more than Michaels, which is why Russo said he did a lot of dealing with Michaels in a role as a buffer for McMahon, and from that knew how hard Michaels was to deal with. Russo also said that in the Boiler Room match with Triple H versus Mankind, where somebody pushed Mankind off a high place in a story that never went anywhere, that the person doing the pushing was supposed to be revealed as Bulldog. Russo noted that Arn Anderson would be getting a big role because of his verbal skills. He said he's looking for something with Lenny Lane and Lodi. He said the company took a stance on them, promising that they'd never be back on television again. He said he went to bat for them, saying it's unfair to punish them by taking away their jobs for doing a good job in an angle the company put them in, but it's been a hard fight. He said that he and Randy Savage came to an agreement on an angle, but Savage's contract is running out and Savage and management are far apart on money figures to the point he thinks it's unlikely he'll still be around, which is why Savage hasn't been on television to follow up on the angle. While Savage has been shopped around by his business manager Henry Holmes, who also manages, among others, Hulk Hogan and Torrie Wilson, the interest at this point isn't strong in WWF either, not because of Savage and his girlfriend's potential marketability, but because the price they're looking for appears to be way above what either company feels their market value is at this point. When asked about what guys he's looking at elevating over the next year, the first 2 names Russo said were Benoit and Jarrett, and talked of them as setting a standard in the ring to get the rest of the wrestlers on top to perform up to, and after that talked about Kidman, although he said he needs more mic skills, Mysterio Jr., Eddie Guerrero and Lash LaRue. He likes that Cajun dialect, which is a work, by the way. He also ripped on the WWF's talent relations department, saying it was holding back the company, never mentioning Ross, who heads the department by name, and claimed WWF was near bankruptcy when he took over writing its TV because Bruce Pritchard and Pat Patterson were still doing TV like it was the 80s and the product was way out of date. Showtime Event Television released its pay-per-view Decade in Review report this past week. It's not what I'd call foolproof because right off the top I noted some obvious omissions from charts, but overall it's about the best report on pay-per-view as a show. The 1999 estimate of pay-per-view revenue is that $1.068 million will come from movies, $486 million from pay-per-view events, boxing, wrestling, etc., and $367 million from porn. Of that $486 million this year, approximately $247 million will come from pro wrestling and $219 million from pro boxing. From 1991 to 1997, boxing greatly outdrew pro wrestling when it came to money most years by an approximately 2-to-1 ratio. In 1998 it completely reversed, with Mike Tyson out of the picture. Pro wrestling did $178 million to $40 million for boxing. By promoter, over the decade of the 90s, Showtime Event Television was the top pay-per-view event promoter, with WWF second, TVKO third, WCW fourth, Semaphore Entertainment Group fifth, and ECW sixth. Of the top 20 most purchased pay-per-view events, as opposed to most revenue, as boxing shows with their higher price tag would dominate wrestling more based on revenue, listed, the top 15 were all boxing matches, with Mike Tyson's 2 fights with Evander Holyfield, the rematch doing 1,990,000 buys and the first match doing 1,600,000 buys, followed by Peter McNeely, 1,580,000, and Frank Bruno, 1,400,000, as the top 4. Numbers 5 through 10 were George Foreman vs. Holyfield, 1991, Oscar de la Hoya vs. Felix Trinidad, 1999, Tyson vs. Razor Ruddock 2, 1991, Holyfield vs. Lennox Lewis, first 1999 fight as opposed to the rematch, Holyfield vs. Buster Douglas, 1990, and Tyson vs. Bruce Seldon, 1996. The biggest pro wrestling event, at number 16, would be this year's WrestleMania headlined by Austin vs. Rock with 850,000 buys according to the report. WWF in its stock offering listed the figure as 800,000 buys although had publicly claimed 875,000. Two other WWF events made the list, WrestleMania 7 in 1991, Hogan vs. Slaughter, listed at 760,000 buys in number 18 position, and WrestleMania VI, Hogan vs. Warrior, listed at 680,000 buys. Obviously there is a mistake here because WrestleMania 14, Austin vs. Michaels with Tyson as referee, did an estimated 730,000 buys, and WWF claimed at the time that figure had set the all-time pro wrestling record, which means the 1991 figure must have been inaccurate as well. It should be noted that far fewer homes had pay-per-view capabilities in the early part of the decade, so actually the most impressive pay-per-view figures realistically for pro wrestling were in the 1986 to 1989 period. The Austin Michaels WrestleMania was also omitted from the list of the 5 biggest pro wrestling events on pay-per-view for the decade, which listed the 3 aforementioned matches, followed by the 1995 Slamboree. Clearly a mistake. That show was headlined by Hogan and Savage vs. Flair and Piper, which actually only did in 0.57 buy rate or about 150,000 buys, and this has it listed as doing 670,000 buys. And in 5th place listed is the 1990 Summer Slam, Hogan vs. Earthquake, at 640,000 buys. For comparison, the biggest concert in the history of pay-per-view was New Kids on the Block I from 1990, promoted by Semaphore Entertainment, which did 260,000 buys. They list the UFC v. Royce Gracie vs. Ken Shamrock 2 as the highest non-boxing or wrestling sporting event with 240,000 buys, followed by UFC 4, Gracie vs. Dan Severn, UFC 7, Shamrock vs. Oleg Toktarov, UFC 8, Ken Shamrock vs. Chemo, and UFC VI, Shamrock vs. Dan Severn. There's an interesting theme of that list. It's generally considered that the biggest drawing card in UFC history was Tank Abbott, which is why he kept getting pushed so hard by the company and given chance after chance both as far as promotional opportunities and in matches after losing. Without a doubt within that genre he was the most charismatic guy in the history of the show because he came along when the buy rates were high. My feeling is if Frank Shamrock had come along and done what he's done in 1995, he'd have been a bigger star, but his great performances came when nobody was watching. However, it's clear from looking at the 5 biggest pay-per-views in company history, if this list is accurate, and looking at the wrestling list has to make it all very suspicious, even though it'll be now reported as fact everywhere that the biggest draw in UFC history was Ken Shamrock. He headlined 4 of the 5 biggest shows in company history. Royce Gracie was only the headliner in 2 of them, Severn 2, although the first of which was also a tournament final, so his name value meant nothing to that one. It also should be noted that of those 5 biggest shows, Abbott only even appeared in 1, and that was his debut show, so his name meant 0 buys for sure during that first appearance because nobody knew who he was until after purchasing that show. The biggest entertainment event in the history of pay-per-view was the 1993 Howard Stern New Year's Eve special, which did 350,000 buys. If you take boxing, wrestling and UFC out of the mix, the biggest sporting event ever on pay-per-view was a 1993 Copa America soccer match with 220,000 buys. While Steve Austin's wrestling career may not be over, the odds are still very long of him participating as a wrestler on the upcoming WrestleMania. The current plans for Austin are to undergo spinal surgery in Cleveland from Dr. Henry Balmont on January 27. The WWF received word on December 7 that Balmont, due to a cancellation, was moving the surgery from the originally planned February 17 date. Austin is ready for the spinal surgery at this point, but Balmont was booked solidly through mid-February when Austin came to him on the recommendation of his neck specialist. He's supposed to train and get himself in good shape for the operation. After the surgery, his neck will be immobilized for about 6 weeks when it can be examined to see how much, if any, permanent damage has been done to the neck and spine. An AP article that came out this past week gave the impression that after the surgery, Austin would be able to return full-time as a wrestler. According to sources close to the situation, what Dr. Balmont meant is that he felt that after the surgery there was no reason Austin couldn't lead a normal life without serious pain. As it regarded taking bumps in a pro wrestling ring, that wouldn't be known until mid-March at the earliest, and even under a best-case scenario he wouldn't be back in the ring until probably April. Austin and the WWF are just going under the assumption that things seem better for a potential comeback this week than they did 2 weeks ago, at which point it appeared his career was over for sure. As things stand right now, WWF is planning on a Hunter Hearst Helmsley vs. Rock main event on the April 2 show from the Anaheim Pond. From this vantage point, it would seem logical to hold off Rock's winning of the title until that point, so there will be a carrot dangling for the fans wanting that as a best way to increase the buy rate and make the show seem special. There are at press time no plans to formulate the top of the Mania card to include Austin, although with the surgery being moved up, it is a possibility he might be ready. Before the date change of surgery, there was no chance of him wrestling on the big show, although he would most likely play a part in some form in the show. Even with the change, at this point those plans aren't likely to change. Ernesto HOOST captured his second K1 Grand Prix championship in the past 3 years, but the biggest news was the failure of the show to sell out the Tokyo Dome for the December 5th finals. It was the third year that K1 had booked the Dome for its biggest event of the year. In 1997, the event sold out 55,000 tickets in a few hours. In 1998 it took a little longer, but still sold out and even sold 3,000 standing room tickets the day of the event to set the all-time attendance record of 63,800. The crowd this year was so disappointing that K1 never released a figure, nor did any of the newspapers print an estimate. The good news is that the show, which was described as explosive with 6 knockout finishes in 8 matches, and exciting, in particular matches with Andy Hug vs. HOOST and a tremendous short all-out slugfest with defending champion Peter Aerts losing to Jerome LeBanner in the first round, drew a 17.9 rating, airing on a tape delay from 10 p.m. to midnight that event, up from the disappointing 15.8 last year. In 1997, the event drew the biggest rating in the history of the Grand Prix finals with a 20.7. HOOST, 34, Holland native known as Mr. Perfect because he's the best technical fighter of all the heavyweights, was ill for last year's tournament and lost in the first round to Sam Greco after winning in 1997 with a decision over Hug. He defeated Mirko Filipovic, a police officer from Croatia, to win the $300,000 first-place check with a knockout at 1:09 of the first round. Filipovic, who seems to have been pushed as the new star the company always tries to create each year, since they are planning to debut with a show in Croatia in March, was a surprise making it into the tournament when he beat Mike Bernardo in a match at the Osaka Dome, and then knocked out both Musashi and Greco to reach the finals. He suffered broken ribs in the Greco match, and when he went into the finals with the broken ribs, couldn't last because he was hit with numerous body shots. HOOST won his first match over crowd favorite and 1996 champion Hug via unanimous decision after 3 rounds, with scores of 30-29, 30-29 and 30-28. In the semifinals, he survived a first-round knockdown at the hands of LeBanner to score a knockout at 26 seconds of round 2. LeBanner defeated 3-time champ, 1994, 1995, 1998 Aerts, generally considered the best heavyweight in the world, with a knockout from a left just 1:23 into the first round. The quarterfinals opened with Greco winning a unanimous decision over Ray Sefo. Filipovic knocked out Musashi, the lone Japanese fighter, to make it in 1:13 of the second round, knocking him down twice with lefts before the ref stopped the fight. HOOST then beat Hug, followed by LeBanner's win over Aerts. The only non-tournament match, held after the semifinals, to give HOOST and Filipovic time to rest for their championship match, saw Stefan Liko knock out Harry Hort. The failure for the first round of the tournament to sell out the Osaka Dome, it drew 32,800 fans in the building, set up for about 45,000 fans for its October 3rd show, which also drew a 13.3 rating, a drop from its all-time record for any show of a 22.8 for the Grand Prix first round at the Osaka Dome the previous year, and Tokyo Dome is largely blamed on the sameness of the look and of the top contenders in the event. This year's Grand Prix largely consisted of the same crowd favorites as in the previous 4 or 5 years. Musashi replacing Masaaki Sadake as the Japanese entrant meant nothing for the gate, since Sadake has the far bigger mainstream name, even though neither were legitimate contenders to win. Fans have seen every conceivable matchup of Hug, Aerts, HOOST, and Mike Bernardo, who are the biggest stars, over and over again for years. The last true new star created was Francisco Filio in 1997, and with his devastating knockout of HOOST early in the year, he was a solid contender this year before going down with an injury and instead winning the Karate World Championships this year. Filipovic, although wins over Bernardo and Greco should be star-making credentials, lacks the charisma the rest of the top fighters have. The Fuji Network, due to K1's strong prime-time ratings track record, is really going to push the show in 2000, with the idea of bringing famous baseball players, movie stars, singers and other celebrities to appear at the events. K1 ran one show in the United States in 1998, which drew a sellout of the live event in Las Vegas at high ticket prices, but was a failure on pay-per-view, garnering just an 0.1 buy rate. The current plan is to return to Las Vegas for a show in May, although the Las Vegas return has been postponed several times over the past year plus. Kenta Kobashi and Jun Akiyama won the most uneventful World's Strongest Tag League tournament in the 23-year history of the event on December 3 at Tokyo Budokan Hall. Kobashi and Akiyama, the current double tag team champions, took their second straight tournament win before a sellout 16,300 fans at Tokyo Budokan Hall, beating Akira Taue and Stan Hansen in 2015 when Akiyama pinned Taue after an exploder suplex after Akiyama had sidestepped Hansen's lariat. The match had tremendous heat and the show was considered a pretty big success, largely due to the reaction to Hansen. At the age of 50, Hansen is the last remaining Major League superstar foreigner. The Funk's Tiger Jeet Singh, Abdullah the Butcher and Mil Mascara still work Japan in small companies. From the early 80s era of big foreign attractions and the business being in prime time on network television, there was the feeling that this was going to be Hansen's last hurrah and his final major show main event. The crowd went crazy with Hansen chants before the show even started. Hansen, unfortunately, is barely mobile these days and looked real bad, but Kobashi and Akiyama sold big for him to give the fans what they wanted, and it was described as a very good match. The tournament was marred by not only an uninteresting lineup, but also poor crowds. Not one show, with the exception of the finals, drew 4,000 fans for a tournament which in years past traditionally would sell out nearly every venue and book the major cities and the major arenas. The finals were decided by 3 matches on December 1st and December 2nd. Mitsuharu Misawa and Yoshinari Ogawa, needing only a draw to advance into at least a playoff on December 3rd for the championship match, lost on December 1st in Gifu before 2,100 fans, barely a half house, to Johnny Ace and Mike Barton when Barton pinned Ogawa with the bell bend in 1848. The win technically left 5 times in contention: Ace and Burton and Misawa and Ogawa, who were in the clubhouse so to speak, with 9 points, Vader and Johnny Smith, and Hansen and Taue, who also had 9 points but had a final match left against each other, and Kobashi and Akiyama, with 8 points, also with a match left. On December 2nd in Gunma, before just 1,800 fans, Kobashi and Akiyama clinched a spot in the finals, beating Gary Albright in Wolf Hockfield when Kobashi lariated Hockfield. This left Hansen and Taue versus Vader and Smith, matching up Hansen and Vader, who lost to Kobashi and Akiyama in last year's finals, which were also supposed to be Hansen's last hurrah. The winning team would face Kobashi and Akiyama. If the match was a 30 minutes draw, both teams along with Kobashi and Akiyama would go into a 3-way playoff at Budokan. As it turned out, they didn't even bother teasing the time limit, as Taue pinned Smith in 12:34 with a choke slam. This left the final standings as 1. Kobashi and Akiyama 5'1", 12 points, 2. Hansen and Taue 5'2", 11, 3. Vader and Smith 4'2", Misawa and Ogawa 4'2", and Ace and Barton 4'2", 9 points each, 6. Yoshihiro Takayama and Takao Omori 2 and 6, 4, 7. Albright and Hockfield 1 and 7 and Tamon Honda 1 and 7, 2 points each. The Triple H Stephanie McMahon soap opera led Raw to more than double the rating of Nitro head-to-head on December 6, including nearly quadrupling the audience during the key quarter of the soap opera. Raw finished with a 5.98 rating, 5.59 first hour, 6.34 seconds hour, and an 8.9 share. Nitro finished with a 3.04 rating, 3.79 first hour, 2.82 seconds hour, 2.54 third hour, and a 4.5 share. Over the head-to-head 2 hours and 5 minutes, Raw did a 5.98 rating to Nitro's 2.68, making it the lowest rated Nitro since Russo and Ferrara changed the show. Monday Night Football did a 14.32 rating and 24.0 share. The overall viewing audience for the night was 10 million. Over the 8-week period since Russo took over the helm of Nitro, the show is averaging a 3.24 rating, slightly down from the 3.38 in September, which was Nash's final month of booking. The closest WCW came was during the main event battle. Raw's main event of Rock and Mankind vs. Snow and Jericho did a 5.73 rating, while Nitro's main event of Goldberg vs. Jarrett in a lumberjack match with all the big stars at ringside and Piper as referee pulled a 3.66 rating. The ultimate destruction came during the 5th competitive segment, where the Triple H interview with Stephanie and Vince McMahon coming out drew a 7.23 rating, destroying the 1.95 rating of the Nash vs. Benoit match. Raw doubled Nitro in 5 of the 8 quarters and tripled it twice, with the Holly vs. Rikishi and confrontation with the women led by BB the New Sable and Ivory drawing a 6.58 rating, while the Nitro Girls Strip Poker Game and Flynn vs. Maestro in the Block drew a 2.14. In the other weekend ratings on December 4, Foot 5, Livewire did a 1.3 rating, well below its usual number. Superstars did a 1.7 and Sunday Night Heat did an unusually high 4.13 rating. WCW Saturday Night delivered a 1.5 rating, making it the second lowest rated show on the station between 9:30 a.m. and 1:30 a.m. Even worse, the show started with a big audience from the movie Moonrakers, which was doing a 3.0, and wrestling started at a strong 2.0, but fell all the way down to a 1.2 for the TV main event. ECW on TNN on December 3 drew a 1.01 rating and 1.7 share, which made it the highest rated show on the station for the night. Roller Jam that followed dropped to an 0.55 rating. Once again, ECW's audience grew throughout the show, peaking at a 1.21 rating for the Limp Bizkit angle. In the Thursday night battle on December 2, SmackDown, with all that media publicity leading into the show, it drew a 4.64 rating and 7.2 share, which is actually right at its recent average. The Thunder Show in opposition did a 1.94 rating, ranging from a low of 1.48, Maestro vs. Hayashi, to a high of 2.30, Vicious vs. Luger. The overall Thursday viewing audience was 9.2 million. For November 29th, the wedding and a huge advertising campaign paced Raw to a strong 6.54 rating, 6.32 first hour, 6.73 seconds hour, doubling Nitro the entire evening, and a 9.9 share to Nitro's 3.10 rating, 3.79 first hour, 2.75 seconds hour, 2.79 third hour, and a 4.5 share. Over the head-to-head 2 hours and 8 minutes, it saw Raw with a 6.43 rating to Nitro's 2.77. NFL Monday Night Football head-to-head did a 13.10 rating and 21.2 share. The overall viewing audience for pro wrestling for the night was up to a healthy 10.6 million. The wedding drew a 7.26 overrun, although that is misleading as it went until 13 minutes after the hour, and even though Nitro stalled to be on last, it eventually, with everyone standing around, went home 8 minutes late, leaving Raw with 5 minutes unopposed. Taking those 5 minutes out, the number is probably around 6.6. From a head-to-head standpoint, it probably wasn't the highest rated segment of the show, since the Triple H vs. Test match earlier did a 6.87 rating, destroying Nash vs. Goldberg, and the Roddy Piper Mud match, which did a 2.73 head-to-head. In the final quarter comparisons, the final Raw quarter featuring the Acolytes Dudley's Brawl and the beginning of the wedding did a 6.34 rating, and the overrun was around 6.6, while Nitro's final with a cage match with Goldberg and Vicious vs. Hall and Nash vs. Benoit and Hart with Piper as ref, all of whom had already appeared earlier in the show in matches, started out with a 2.94 final quarter and fell to a 2.67 overrun. Nitro's actual high points were the beginning of the cage match and the Hart vs. Meng title match. The low point was a 2.46 for the Williams vs. Only cage match, so much for the Jim Ross parody being justified by the ratings. Other miserable ratings for what should be high-profile matches with Hall vs. Sid at 2.57 and Sting vs. Benoit vs. Jarrett at 2.71. Raw also scored a 6.74 quarter for The Rock and Mankind and Kane vs. Outlaws and X-Pac match. Numbers for the November 27th to 28th weekend saw Livewire at 1.7, Superstars at 1.9 and Sunday Night Heat at 3.08. WCW Saturday Night drew a 1.6, which would make it the second lowest rated show on the station between 9:30 a.m. and 2 a.m. TBS ran Rocky Movies 3, 4 and 5 from noon to 6 p.m. drawing 1.6, 2.1 and 2.1 rating, and followed Wrestling with For Your Eyes Only doing a 3.1 and Never Say Never Again, 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. at 2.7. Even the fourth consecutive Family Matters rerun at 9:30 a.m. drew the same 1.6 as Wrestling. The November 30th WWF's Greatest Hits on UPN drew a 3.01 rating and 4.7 share, which is up a little from UPN's prime-time average. Japanese television rundown. November 20th New Japan. 1. Hiro Saito and Satoshi Kojima beat Akira and Michael Wallstreet in 11:33. The last 6 minutes aired. Saito pinned Akira after a German suplex and sent him off the top. Basic good TV match. 2 3/4 stars. 2. Atani and Kanemoto beat Liger and Samurai in 12:56. The last 6 minutes aired. Typical really good fast-paced match you'd figure from these four. Some nice near falls ending when Atani used a springboard dropkick to the back and a spider bomb to pin Samurai. Kanemoto easily looked the best of the four. 3.5 stars. 3. Muto and Tenzan beat Sasaki and Takashi Iizuka in 14:09. The last 9:30 aired. Tenzan worked most of the way to protect Muto. Finish saw Muto use a dragon screw and figure 4 on Iizuka. 2.75 stars. 4. Nagata and Nakanishi beat Chono and NWO Sting in 13:32. The entire match aired. Kind of boring, but they kept the action moving. It picked up when Nakanishi used a belly-to-belly overhead suplex on NWO Sting, a spear on Chono but Sting in the rack but Chono saved. Finish saw Nakanishi very clumsily get Sting back in the torture rack. 1.25 stars. November 21st Dream Stage Entertainment. This was the Pride 8 pay-per-view show from the Tokyo Ariake Coliseum, the first sellout in the history of the promotion. It wasn't that spectacular, but the main event, because of its historical nature, made it probably the best show in company history. For action and being a competitive match, the main event wasn't the match of the year, but for impact and probable long-term history, it may have been the most significant match this year. It is being reported in the martial arts press that this was the third straight profitable show for DSE, but that may not be the case. When Naohito Morishita had the meeting with WWF, they were talking to WWF as if they want to get out of the real fight business because of so many expenses in flying in and housing not only fighters, but also their entourage. 1. Wanderlei Silva beat Daijiro Matsui via unanimous decision after 20 minutes. In the first round, Silva blocked a takedown and got on top and threw a few weak punches. Matsui got to his feet, which wasn't good because Silva was the superior stand-up fighter. Silva bloodied his nose, hitting him with solid shots. Silva got more shots in, cutting him over the left eye, bloodying him worse. Matsui, who was all bloody, let it all hang out and they had a good slugfest standing at the end of the round, but Matsui couldn't hang with him. Matsui took him down into his guard. Silva got a mount and was pounding him, and kicked him hard when he was down. As he got up, Silva rocked him badly with a high kick at the end of the round. In the second round, Silva got on top but went for a choke 230 in and Matsui reversed him, with Silva holding guard and actually scoring more from the bottom. Matsui got a solid shot in on Silva's right eye, which was cut and almost swollen shut by the end of the match. Matsui deserves a lot of credit for hanging in against an opponent with far more firepower. Good opener. 2. Frank Trigg beat Fabiano Iha in 4:59. This was American wrestler versus Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Iha caught Trigg in a triangle choke, but Trigg actually gave him a short powerbomb-like move to power out. Trigg got some solid punches in from the top and more punches and knees. Trigg hit him with a flurry in the corner and the ref stopped the match. 3. Alan Goes beat Karl Malenko in 9:16. This was Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu versus American Pro Wrestling. After dominating the stand-up, Goes got the top position on the ground at 4 minutes. He went for an armbar, but got reversed. Malenko got a mount but couldn't do anything as Goes was able to push off with his legs and keep distance and stand up. Goes then took him down again, and clamped on an over and under choke for the tap. This wasn't a good spectator match as Goes mostly dominated him on the ground. 4. Mark Coleman beat Ricardo Moraes via unanimous decision after 20 minutes. Coleman physically looked different from his UFC days. He no longer looked like a bodybuilder nor freakish. And he also didn't get tired in this match. In the first round, Coleman kept his distance and got a takedown at 3 minutes and Moraes got guard. Moraes got away once but Coleman took him down right away. Coleman mostly held him down until the end of the round, connecting with a few body and head shots. In the second round, Coleman took him down immediately. Coleman tried a neck lock several times and threw a few punches. He kept going for a neck lock. He got a full mount and threw a few punches from that position but mainly kept Moraes on his back the rest of the fight. A boring spectator fight. 5. Tom Erickson beat Gary Goodridge via unanimous decision after 20 minutes. This fight was almost identical to the previous one. Erickson isn't at all pretty to watch, nor does he have a pretty body, but he's this huge guy who is just too strong for probably anyone except a world-class wrestler. They had an exciting start, both going all out throwing punches and kicks. Erickson actually more than held his own with Goodridge just on superior size and power as his punching technique looked awful, but it's a 290-pound guy who can move throwing. He got a mount and punched away till Goodridge got the guard. Erickson still pounded on him a lot. Goodridge tried a choke from the bottom but Erickson broke it quickly. Erickson's punches gave Goodridge a bloody nose, and he threw some more punches from the top at the end of the round. In the second round, Eriksson took him down again. Goodridge got some decent shots in from the bottom and held guard. Eriksson got a few punches in from the top as well. Eriksson really didn't win this round by much, but easily won the first round. Except for a few spurts, this was another boring spectator match. 6. Igor Vovchanchyn killed Francisco Bueno dead in 124. He crushed him with a right and connected on a second punch to Bueno as he was on the way down. This was devastating. 7. Renzo Gracie won a unanimous decision over Alexander Otska after 20 minutes. Otska took Gracie down first, which got a big pop, and threw some body blows. Gracie threw a really good kick from the bottom while laying on his back, which opened up a forehead cut that Otska had taped up from a recent pro wrestling match. Otska was back on top but in the guard. Gracie had him all tied up in the guard. After they got up, Gracie dominated standing with leg kicks and Otska took him down again. Even though Otska got 2 or 3 clean takedowns, Gracie still won the round. Otska took him down again in the second round and was bleeding all over the place, both his pro wrestling forehead cut being opened and also from a bloody nose. Gracie nearly got an armbar, but Otska escaped and they ended up in a scramble with Gracie getting on top. Otska got an escape with 2 minutes left and Gracie threw him with a really cool looking back suplex and held him down until the finish. 8. Kazushi Sakuraba beat Royler Gracie in 28-17 of a 30 minutes time limit match. Sakuraba was announced at 193 pounds and Gracie at 151. Gracie did absolutely nothing on offense the entire match, with his entire strategy apparently being to stall out the time limit since there would be no judge's decision at his camp's late insistence. Fans booed the announcement of no judges for this match and booed Gracie heavily. The match was super drama, not that it was a great fight because it was one-sided and really a battle against the clock more than anything, but the heat was intense. Gracie shot in immediately but Sakuraba blocked it and Gracie held him in a guard and neutralized him for several minutes. Sakuraba escaped from the guard at 3:40 and both were on their feet. Gracie tried another takedown. Sakuraba caught him coming in with a knee which stunned him and gave him good position on the ground. The place went nuts. Sakuraba threw some good punches before Gracie got a guard, but Sakuraba got away. Gracie laid on his back at 5:30. Sakuraba was standing and Gracie laid on his back. Sakuraba started kicking at Gracie's right leg, then left leg, then he connected with a hell of a head kick. Gracie deserves credit for not quitting at that point. The head kick made him decide to stand up at 6:50. Sakuraba kicked him in the stomach and Gracie stumbled. Sakuraba threw a good punch and Gracie decided it was best to lay on his back as he dropped at 7:45. Gracie looked really concerned, seeing there was nothing he could do and he had 22 minutes of torture left. Sakuraba kept throwing leg kicks. His right leg was all bruised up. This continued with Sakuraba gaining confidence. By the end of the first 15 minutes round, Gracie's right thigh and shin were discolored. In the second round, Sakuraba snuck in a knee, delivered a good right to the head and a leg lick. Sakuraba knocked Gracie down with a high kick at 2:10. Sakuraba continued throwing leg kicks until Gracie got up. Sakuraba kicked him, then made him stagger with a punch at 4:05. Gracie tried to shoot, but with no legs, Sakuraba easily avoided it. He tried a high kick but Gracie blocked it. Sakuraba continued with kicks to the body and legs before doing a spin kick, as a tribute to his childhood idol Tiger Mask, doing as close to a rolling savate as you can do in a real fight. Sakuraba knocked him down again after a kick to his bad right leg. Gracie went to his back again 9-10 into the round. At this point Sakuraba went down with him and tried to finish him. He went first for a straight armbar but couldn't get it perfect. He then maneuvered the arm into a chicken wing at 12 minutes. Gracie was trapped at this point. Sakuraba really bent his arm up to the point it looked sick and Gracie was crying in pain. It appeared Sakuraba had him but didn't want to hurt him, and Gracie wasn't going to tap. Sakuraba, it certainly appeared, could have torn out his shoulder with a hold but wanted someone to stop the fight before he injured the guy, which is how the Japanese were taught. Finally at 13:17 of the round, a referee at ringside ordered the match stopped. Royler and Hickson were furious it was stopped. The crowd exploded. Realistically, they should have been thankful Sakuraba was trained as a sportsman, and all the cries from the jiu-jitsu camp about a hometown decision, an early stoppage, are a joke. He wasn't getting out of the hold and he wasn't going to last another 143 without serious damage because he wasn't going to tap and his brother wasn't going to throw in the towel. They were clearly going to trade a torn-up shoulder for the glory in the future of saying he lasted 30 minutes with one of the two best fighters in the world and giving up 42 pounds, even though he was risking his career. This psychology may sound noble to a pro wrestling fan brought up on tapping is for prelim and mid-card guys, but in the real world what glory is there in stupidity? The Gracies should have been sportsmen enough to admit Sakuraba beat him, especially since Royler got no offense in the entire match, rather than run him down saying his punches didn't hurt and cry about the weight advantage. The reason they took the fight in the first place was because the weight advantage would give them an out if they lost, and they manipulated the rules so their guy just had to stall and not lose, and their system is very effective at that game, which is an entirely different tactic as would be used in any kind of combat sports competition, because judges would negate the stalling tactic. And their strategy almost worked. When it didn't, they really looked bad complaining. November 27, New Japan. 1. Liger and Osamu Kido beat Kanemoto and Shiro Koshinaka in 13-11. The last 5 minutes aired. The crowd was really into it. Big pop as Liger did a pescado followed by Kanemoto doing a plancha and nearly hitting the apron, and Kido, at age 49, did a pescado. It was probably about the first one he's done in 10 years and the place went nuts for it. Real good heat for the near falls as well, which ended when Kido used the Wakigatami, Fujiwara armbar, for the submission on Kanemoto. 3.25 stars. 2. Atani pinned Kendo Kashin in 11:48. 7 minutes aired. Kashin used the Shattered Dreams kick on Atani. Atani used a springboard spin kick and a quick German suplex for a hot near fall. Kashin came back with a torture rack followed by a Texas cloverleaf, but Atani made the ropes. Atani came back with a German suplex, a springboard drop kick and a dragon suplex for the pin. A good match, but not on the level of most New Japan Junior matches. 3 stars. 3. Tenryu and Nakanishi beat Sasaki and Fujita in 11:21. The last 8 minutes aired. This was an interesting match and hot in spots with Tenryu carrying things. He physically at age 49 looks really sagging, and with all the hard style matches he's done he should be like Stan Hansen, but somehow he's still good. At one point Tenryu threw down ref Masao Hattori and body slammed him. Fujita then speared Tenryu. Fujita was really green and his offense on Tenryu looked bad, almost minor leaguish, which in New Japan is the kiss of death because everyone is such a good technical wrestler. Tenryu wouldn't sell the bad offense either. Nakanishi isn't much either, but Tenryu and Sasaki both looked pretty good. Tenryu ended up pinning Fujita after 2 power bombs and a Northern Lights bomb, so he did Sasaki's own hold on Sasaki's partner. 2.25 stars. 4. Muto and Kojima beat Chono and Akira in 13:59. The last 9 minutes aired. It was a good-paced, solid match. Akira is one of the most underrated workers in the business. He's generally a jobber for Chono's matches because he's a semi-regular because he's an actor, but his work is great in these matches. Match had a really hot finish with Muto giving Chono a missile dropkick, Akira giving Muto a missile dropkick, but Kojima turning Akira upside down as he did a spin bump of a hard lariat. 3.25 stars. Mexico. The December 3rd Arena Mexico show was headlined by Pierroth Jr. beating Brasso de Plata in their singles hair versus hair match. The match was said to be in the negative star range because Super Porky has gotten ridiculously fat and slow. Pequeno Pierroth, mini in Pierroth outfit with Pierroth's old mask, and a masked man wearing Pierroth's old mask came to ringside. Ref Babe Richard told them to leave and while distracted missed a near fall. The 2 masked men were carrying a boombox and just as Brasso de Plata was about to do his finisher, they turned on the tape player and it played sounds of the piglet Pepe Pepe, Brasso de Plata's pet that Pierroth stole in what has been the company's silliest and also most pushed angle in a long time. And considering this match was the blow-off for the angle and drew a poorhouse only 3,800 in the 17,000 set arena, which is less than they draw on many Tuesdays and Sundays at Coliseo. Pequeno Pierroth held up a photo of a sliced-up piglet. Brasso de Plata was distracted, turned around and was hit with a lariat and pinned. The fans hated this finish. It wasn't a heat reaction but a groaning reaction. In addition, for the plaque of the Legend of the Silver Mask, El Hijo del Santo after 2 years finally got the plaque for his brother beating Scorpio Jr., last year's tournament plaque winner, in a singles match said to have been real good, using his father's camel clutch finisher. Even though it was a loaded show, including Gigante Silva, the crowd was down for more than 10,000 the previous week for a triangle hair match with the same 2 guys and Apollo Dantes and an IWGP Junior title defense by Jushin Liger against Shocker. The final Arena Mexico of the year on December 10th won't have the Atlantis vs Villano Tercero mask vs mask match after all, so who knows if they'll ever do it. Instead, the traditional International Grand Prix singles tournament has been replaced by Torneo 12, a 4-team trios tournament with Shocker and Scorpio Jr. and Bestia Salvaje El Satánico and Rey Bucanero and Ultimo Guerrero, Los Nuevos Infernales, Negro Casas and Tarzan Boy and Felino and Emilio Charles Jr. and Mr. Niebla and Antifaz plus Rayo de Jalisco Jr. defends the CMLL World Heavyweight title against Universo 2000. The death of the Grand Prix probably relates to the fallout with Victor Quiñones. As you can see, no international talent was brought in for the final show of the year, and you can't very well have that tournament and only use the wrestlers you have on the show every Friday. This will be the last show at Arena Mexico until February 19th, as the main Friday night shows are moving to Arena Coliseo. After being fired by WCW, Hector Garza signed a 3-year contract with AAA to heat up the Octagon vs. Jacquemate mask vs. mask match on December 10th in Madero. Ovaciones for the first time ever took a new angle, interviewing each man's wife. In addition, Octagon announced that if he lost the match, he would retire from wrestling and go back to practicing law. He really passed the bar and was a lawyer before becoming Octagon. Mrs. Jacquemate was given by her real name, Azucena Betancourt. AAA brought in Quiñones for 2 TV tapings, including December 3rd in Tijuana as the head of LLL, the heel group doing the NWO angle feuding with AAA. Takamichi Noku was scheduled to work the TV but was injured in his November 30th match in Anaheim, California against Mark Henry and couldn't go. So they did an angle where the AAA wrestlers gave him the dreaded Martinete and he was stretchered out. Miguel Perez and Savio Vega will be wrestling on AAA's big show on December 10th in Madero. There will be a show on December 10th in Tijuana with Conan and Elio Del Santo and Psicosis as the main event face trio against Rey Mysterio Sr. and Blue Panther and Damien, plus a singles match for the old IWA World Heavyweight title with Mil Mascaras vs. Cien Caras. Despite the fact Cien and Mascaras have feuded for a quarter century, and that's not an exaggerated figure, this is said to be their first singles match ever. La Parca is also on the show. On the November 30th Arena Coliseo show in Mexico City, in a trios match with Olympico and Super Astro and Antifaz, formerly Antifaz del Norte, beating Black Warrior and Rey Bucanero and El Satánico, saw Olympico pin Warrior clean to set up Warrior defending his NWA Light Heavyweight title against Olympico on December 7th in the same building. On the December 2nd IWRG TV tapings, they had a ceremony honoring Javier Llanes, a former wrestler. Both Scorpio Jr. and Sr. attacked him to set up a new feud. On December 9th, Scorpio Sr. and Llanes will be on opposite sides of the main event trios match. Gigante Silva also debuts for the IWRG on that show. El Mexicano lost his hair for the second time this year on November 26th in Pantitlán in a cage match where the last man in the cage lost his hair or mask, which included many of AAA's biggest names. The original Mascara Sagrada regained the WWO heavyweight title, beating Universo 2000 on December 1st in Acapulco. Bombero Infernal beat veteran Kato Kung Lee Sr. on December 5th in Naucalpan in a hair versus hair match. Fantasma Jr. will be debuting early next year. Apparently he's wrestled under a mask with a secret name in smaller Mexico City arenas. They had exams on December 4th for new wrestlers before the commission to obtain licenses to work the DF. Only 21 wrestlers applied, none women, and Ovaciones reported that as a group they had poor physical conditioning and stamina. All Japan. Toshiaki Kawada will return on the January tour, but not necessarily for the start of the tour. Besides the tournament finals, the top matches on the Budokan show on December 3rd were 6-man tags. Vader and Johnny Smith and Manukia Mossman beat Mitsuharu Misawa and Yoshinari Ogawa and Satoru Asako in 21:35 when Smith pinned Asako with his favorite reverse DDT. The other was Takao Mori and Yoshihiro Takayama and Takeshi Morishima beating Wolf Hockfield and Johnny Ace and Mike Burton when Mori pinned Hockfield in 13:36 after the Axe Bomber. The first Budokan Hall show of next year will be on February 27th, and it'll be the first ever All Japan afternoon show in the building. The rest of the Budokan schedule for 2000 is April 15th, which will be the Champion Carnival Finals, June 9th, July 23rd, September 2nd, October 28th, the 28th anniversary show, and December 9th, Tag Team Tournament Finals. The main event on the January 31st Giant Baba Memorial Day show. It will be the 1-year anniversary of his death. At Korakuen Hall will be Misawa and Kenta Kobashi and Jun Akiyama forming a rare combination against Stan Hansen and Akira Taue and Omori. November 21st TV show did a 3.2 rating. New Japan. New Japan held a last-minute press conference on December 2nd and strongly hinted of a Shinya Hashimoto and Takashi Iizuka vs. Naoya Ogawa and Kazunari Murakami main event, and in a second press conference on December 6th Tatsumi Fujinami announced the match. Obviously this is to enable them to save Hashimoto vs. Ogawa for the April Dome show, since without it, they have no show, but to get them on the card since the advance is so disappointing. Last year on January 4th, Iizuka punched Murakami after the first, not actually the first since Hashimoto and Ogawa did 2 matches in 1997, but the first of this shoot series, Hashimoto-Ogawa match. Now while the first match was pretty much an understood shoot, no double cross involved, and the finish was at least understood going in by Hashimoto from what it appeared, but they were pretty much shooting in the ring, and it's pretty well assured that the wrestlers around ringside based on their reactions weren't clued into anything, and the post-match fight was clearly a real-life bench-clearing brawl. None of the boys were clued in. The post-match temper flaring in the ring was clearly and obviously not worked, planned or anything, and in that, Murakami got punched by Iizuka, and a year later they're playing off that to create this match. Even though that scene was memorable, my feeling is a shoot-style feud doesn't work well in a tag situation, and Iizuka has no charisma, and Murakami, who has potential as a worker and has a shoot rep from his appearances on old Extreme Fighting Championship pay-per-view events in the US, just don't have strong enough names to be in such a high-profile match for ticket-selling purposes. They also announced Satoshi Kojima vs. Shiro Koshinaka, since Kojima originally was to face Iizuka. The feeling right now is that just because of the history of January 4th, it'll end up selling a lot more tickets than the October 11th show, which was one of the worst attended Dome shows legit in company history. New Japan was continuing to promote Liger vs. Kanemoto as the junior title match for the Dome all this past week. The title change in WCW was acknowledged because on December 1st, Kanemoto did an interview blaming Liger for losing the IWGP Junior title to a no-name foreigner, and said if Liger doesn't bring it back, he'd go to WCW and bring it back himself. While in Mexico, Liger posed with a photo of Gigante Silva, who actually wore Liger's belt. Because people with giantism change so rapidly, it's unbelievable now how much Silva looks like Andre facially. As it turned out, because he was scheduled in an advertised big main event on a fairly major show, Keiji Muto returned on December 1st in Kyoto before a sellout 5,500. On top, Don Frye and Masahiro Chono beat Muto and Satoshi Kojima in 10:52 when Chono pinned Muto. They made a big deal about Muto returning after the death of both his mother and his wrestling coach, Matsuda. Before the match started, 2 masked men attacked Muto and Kojima with chairs and tables, and both juiced heavily, which enabled Muto to just sell most of the match and protect his knees. The masked men were Chono and Michael Wallstreet. Then Frye and Super J came out to make it 4-on-2 until Hiro Saito and Hiroyoshi Tenzan made the save. Brian Johnston also returned to Japan on that show. The biggest show of the week was December 5th in Nagoya before a sellout 9,000. In the main event, Yuji Nagata and Manabu Nakanishi retained the IWGP Tag titles, beating Kojima and Tenzan in 1849. The finish saw Nakanishi apparently turn on Nagata, putting him in the torture rack. But from that position he threw Nagata onto Kojima. Nagata then pinned Kojima after a back suplex. Super J and Chono beat Muto and Saito when Chono pinned Sato in 15:36. There were 2 interesting undercard results. Kazuyuki Fujita scored his biggest career win beating Tatsutoshi Goto, and Shinya Makabe also scored his biggest career win using a Boston Crab on El Samurai. Makabe, who has improved into being a really good worker, will be brought into a regular part of the junior heavyweight division next year. Sasaki suffered a neck injury on December 4th, and is scheduled to be back by December 9th. Naoto Gombe, 20, whose older brother Hiromitsu Gombe was a national champion amateur wrestler recruited into New Japan by Hase Hiroshi and died in his first few days of pro training. The incident actually led to Hase quitting New Japan for All Japan because of how New Japan handled the situation, has joined New Japan. November 20th TV show did a 2.9 rating, which is pretty amazing since the show aired from 2:40 a.m. to 3:40 a.m. Other Japan notes. Rings held a press conference on December 2nd and Akira Maeda didn't attend. They said he was still suffering from headaches from the Yoji Anjo incident. They announced the bracketing for the December 22nd Osaka Furitsu Gym second half of the tournament. Matches are Andre Coppola vs. Castelo Branco, a Brazilian who I've never seen before, Ricardo Fait, a real entertaining Dutch fighter who is not going to last in the tournament but has great charisma, versus Tyrone Roberts, younger brother of former UFC fighter Andre Roberts, and said to be the better fighter of the two, and with more ground fighting experience should be the favorite here. Volkan vs. Joe Slick, who is coming off a UFC Japan win over Jason DeLucia and is much younger, but is giving up 30 pounds against a legit but aging submission expert, Wataru Sakata versus Renzo Gracie. It looks like the idea here is to set up a Gracie versus Han match, which would be interesting for Japan, although Han would have 40 pounds on Gracie. Han, 38, who is super in submission and in his prime, was an incredible worker, but he's a few years past that now, hasn't fought a true shoot match with striking allowed in years, if in fact he ever has, as his true sports background was as a Sambo world champion, which is a non-striking sport. Bitsaje Terriel versus Gilbert Yvel looks on paper to be very entertaining, as Yvel is a great kickboxer, and Terriel, who also never does shoot matches with this group, is going to have a 100-pound weight advantage. Tsuyoshi Kosaka versus Christopher Haseman. If Kosaka wins, it'll likely set up his third meeting this year with Yvel, but I'm really concerned about Kosaka fighting 2 fights in a row so close to taking the beating from Pedro Rizzo on November 14th. After all the beatings he's taken this year, including a real tough fight with Yvel the first time and breaking his wrist against Yvel the second time. Boris Giliaskov versus Tim Lajic. An interesting battle, as both are good wrestlers of about the same size. Lajic will be the better striker, but Giliaskov may have better conditioning, but this is a 10 minutes time limit. And Kiyoshi Tamura versus UFC lightweight champ Pat Miletic. Tamura will probably go in with about a 10-pound weight edge, which is rare as he's never bigger than his opponent. Miletic is a very good all-around fighter. Either way, if it's a shoot, the Tamura-Miletic winner is going to be giving away a ton of weight to whomever they face in the second round, and it's almost a no-win for Tamura. If he wins, he beats a smaller guy. If he loses, he's lost to a smaller guy who fights as a lightweight, and he's Ring's world heavyweight champion, so it makes their title, which is a worked belt, look really bad, especially if he's unable to get out of the first round of the tournament. That's the problem with booking real shoot tournaments, because you can't protect your drawing cards very well. You can up to a point, but eventually in a 32-man tourney you can't. In many ways, this is really intriguing because there are guys who have been predominantly pro wrestlers in a tournament against guys who have never done pro wrestling. The first tournament on October 28th certainly didn't look at all fishy, but the jury is out until after this one is over. If Tamura loses to Miletic, it won't be good for business, and that has to be a consideration. The Japanese pro wrestling magazines covered the Ogawa/Takada angle at the DSE press conference as the leading pro wrestling news story of the week. At the press conference, there was pub photos taken of several of the fighters scheduled for the January 30th Tokyo Dome show behind a gigantic Pride World Heavyweight Championship belt. Among those there were Takada Sakuraba, Gary Goodridge, Royce Gracie, Mark Coleman, Igor Vovchanchyn, and Mark Kerr. It will be the highest ticket prices for a Tokyo Dome show in history, with VIP ringside at 100,000 yen, about $950, and the cheapest seats at $57. The original Hayabusa and Mr. Ganisu, teaming together for the first time since ending their feud, won the WEW tag titles from Tetsuhiro Kuroda and Hiskatsu Oya on December 1st in Osaka before 1,250 fans. Shawn Michaels' trainees American Dragon and Lance Cade debuted on the show in a tag match, beating Ricky Fuji and Flying Kid Ichihara. Masato Tanaka pinned Yoshinori Sasaki in the semifinal. After the match, Tanaka complained that after beating Koto Fuyuki in the Loser Leaves Town match on November 23rd, that he was put in a singles match in a major city against a prelim wrestler. Based on live reports from Americans who were there, the production of the FMW November 23rd show was described as WWF pay-per-view caliber. Judging from photos, it looked even more impressive as they had 2 huge Titantron-like screens on each side of a huge entrance setting. Kanemaru came from the top of the stage, which looked to be 14 feet from the floor, with basically falling in a sitting position onto balls Mahoney through 2 tables, which may not have broken. There was one dangerous spot in that match where the tables didn't break, and that was the spot he actually got hurt on. Fuyuki was at the Neo Ladies show on December 2nd, which ended up setting up a man versus woman cage match for the first time ever in Japan under old-style Texas death rules. Pinfalls don't count. The only way the match ends is if the loser of the fall can't answer a 10 count after the fall, against Kyoko Inoue. Big Japan ran a major show on December 4th at Yokohama Bunka Gym. In the main event, which was a battle to use the Samples name, Mike Samples beat Black Samples, Genesu Kobayashi. Ryuji Yamakawa won the Big Japan Death Match title from Shadow WX in one of those sick matches with all the gimmicks that teenagers all over the US will try and emulate in a ring filled with glass. Also, in a surprise result, Tomoaki Honma scored a clean pinfall win over Abdullah the Butcher. Karl Malenko and Katsumi Yujiro won the Battle Arts Tag Team Tournament, beating Yuki Ishikawa and Masaki Mochizuki in the finals on December 5th in Motokawago. Here and there. The funeral for Yasuhiro Kojima, The only native Japanese wrestler ever given serious consideration to be NWA World Heavyweight Champion when the belt was the belt in pro wrestling, better known in wrestling circles as Hiro Matsuda, took place on December 5 in Tampa. Among the 150 attending were Jack Briscoe, Dory, and Marty Funk, Ron Red, Buddy Colt, Don Beetleman, Don Curtis, Dan Miller, Masa Saito, Masao Hattori, Osamu Nishimura, Gordon Solie, Terry Bollea, Hulk Hogan, Jimmy Hart, Paul Orndorff, Yuli Fifida, Meng, Jerry Brenneman, Jerry Flynn, Dick Slater, Brian Yandrasovitz, Knobs, Brian Blair, Steve Kieran, Dave Cannell, Cuban Assassin, Bill Alfonso, Mike Davis, Bugsy McGraw, Dean and Joe Simon, Malenko Brothers, and Sean Royal. Blair gave a speech talking about training under Matsuda and talking about how such a high percentage of his students wound up making money in pro wrestling. Howard Brody talked about Matsuda the businessman, and his daughter Stephanie talked about him as a father. New Japan went all out in preparation for the funeral. Jerry Monty passed away on December 3 at the age of 57 due to liver cancer. Real name Jerry Monty, he was easily the most famous television jobber in Northern California during the 70s and continued to wrestle into the 80s for the AWA and WWF as a jobber, and later promoted and trained wrestlers in the area. He had been hospitalized for a few weeks after passing out due to the cancer and getting into a serious auto accident. He returned from the hospital on December 2 and the word was out earlier in the week that he had little time left, and he passed away the next day. Monty's funeral was December 5 in Hayward, with the only wrestling people attending being Woody Farmer, Shane Cody and Mike Dubois. Alexis Smirnoff, who worked with Monty running a wrestling school in the 80s that got a good deal of local pub at one time. Rolling Stone is finishing up about a dozen articles for its pro wrestling issue that will come out early next year. Among the issues covered, seriously, besides an overview of wrestling complete with historical pieces, are a story on two of the major issues regarding pro wrestling today, the history of midget wrestling and a story on pro wrestling groupies. Catch Wrestling Association ran a 10-show tour in Bremen, Germany, including its annual Euro Catch Festival on December 4. The wrestlers imported were Yutaka Yoshi of New Japan Pro Wrestling, Tiger Steel, a protege of Shawn Michaels from San Antonio, Giant Butch Bronson, 26 years old and described as totally green, Black Navy SEAL, Eddie Jackie from Florida who has worked a lot in Puerto Rico, and Ricky Santana. The best workers were Steel, Ulf Herman, and Robbie Brookside. Christian Eckstein was not at 100% after breaking his arm earlier this year. Schumann, who years back was a very good worker, was described as out of shape and horrible in most of his matches. Santana didn't look comfortable working the European round system. Crowds ranged from a low of 170 to a high of 650 for Ladies' Night, and all shows had themes such as Street Fight Night, Chain Match Night. Not that all matches would be under those rules, but the main event would be the Euro Catch Festival, a throwback to the days when CWA was one of the major promotions in the world, drew 2,000 fans, headlined by Schumann retaining the CWA middleweight title, beating Jesus Cristobal from Mexico, brought in just for this show, better known as Zorro in EMLL, and who has wrestled some of late in ECW. The match was described as great due to Cristobal's stiffness and the crowd reactions. Also on that show they brought in their World Heavyweight Champion Rambo, Luke Poirier, better known as Sniper in WWF, as part of the ill-fated Truth Commission gimmick, who pinned Kurgan in a negative star match after a body slam. Robbie Brookside retained his Commonwealth title, beating Jason Anderson. Tony St. Clair, who has to be close to 50 by now, retained his IC title, beating Joe E. Legend Joe Hilken, a WWF developmental performer who has worked for this group in the past as tag team partner with ECW's Rhino Richards, and Santana and Seal retained the tag titles, which they won on November 27, beating Dirk Rotzik and Michael Kovac. The belts were vacant as Rhino and Legend were the last champs, beating Kovac and Rotzik, while Karsten Kretschmer retained his junior title, beating Bronson, and Steele won the Bremen Cup, beating Herman in the finals of a good match. Yoshi got a CWA junior title match against Kretschmer, losing on the November 27 show. Jerry Monty, regular opening match wrestler for Roy Shire in the 70s who later would work as a TV jobber for AWA and WWF well into the 80s, is said to be in bad shape after blacking out while driving and suffering an auto accident, and he was hospitalized last week. A group called Pro Wrestling Alliance has announced a rock and wrestling pay-per-view show on December 18 for a January air date to be filmed at the Oakland Coliseum Arena. Listen to this, they are estimated the pay-per-view will generate $2.4 million. WCW shows aren't even doing that anymore, and this is for a taped show, which traditionally don't well on pay-per-view. They are listing Lit, L7, Soaked and Biff Naked as musical groups, Pauly Shore as the wrestling ring announcer, Tommy Chong as the wrestling color commentator, and unknown women wrestlers trained by Mondo Guerrero as the wrestling talent. Peggy Gilbert has asked Randy Hales and WMC-TV to make a retraction because Brian Christopher in an interview claimed Doug Gilbert was the son of Peggy and an ice cream man, an angle Peggy Gilbert never agreed to be part of. Kevin Northcutt and Jimmy James won the NWA tag titles from Team Extreme, Kit Carson and Chris Germany, on November 26 in North Richland Hills, Texas. Gordon Soley is said to be in really good spirits, recovering from the larynx removal. He can talk with a voice gimmick similar to that of Kane where it sounds like he's a computer. He's planning on having an operation early next year to have a voice box put in. Rico Constantino added the Power Pro title to his Ohio Valley title, which I guess should show how high Jim Cornette is on the guy. Cornette is now booking Power Pro largely at the directive of the WWF, which is supporting both OVW and PPW through sending talent and paying them to get experience there among other things, which explains why so many Ohio Valley guys are working that circuit on the weekends. Constantino, who was given a big video push before his arrival, beat Steve Bradley in his first appearance on December 4th at the Memphis TV taping, despite tons of interference from Cornette, Sin, and Seven. They did a great job in getting him over as the crowd that had never seen live before was chanting his name. Bradley may be on the way out and they got rid of Mike Tierney, headed most likely to ECW, with last week's Loser Leaves Town match and announced that Glenn Kulka had been fired, also ECW bound. WWF is also going to start having commercials and promos air for the OVW shows in Louisville on its Louisville syndicated show. John Molinaro of Slam Sports wrote an awesome article on the late Art Barr on the 5th anniversary of his death. Eddie Williams was the first pro wrestler named to the Missouri State Sports Hall of Fame in Jefferson City, Missouri. I'm not familiar with Williams, but according to his Hall of Fame bio, he wrestled from 1933 to 1968 and held the World Light Heavyweight and the Pacific Coast Light Heavyweight titles, and now owns a woodworking business in Springfield, Missouri. Williams is the second man associated with pro wrestling to be inducted, since they inducted Sam Mushnick in 1992. Joe Garagiola, who at one point announced pro wrestling, is also in the Hall, but obviously not for his accomplishments as a wrestling announcer. I'm not sure how if they were going to induct a pro wrestler, they didn't induct Luthez, who grew up in St. Louis, or even Harley Race, who was from Kansas City. According to Ring Around the Northwest, Billy Jack Haynes has resurfaced in Oregon and is claiming he's opening a wrestling school. The same newsletter also reported the passing away of Johnny War Eagle at the age of approximately 55. War Eagle started his career in Montreal in 1964 and wrestled in Texas, Louisiana, Colorado, the Central States, Oregon, British Columbia, and Vermont. He held the Pacific Northwest Tag Team titles with Billy White Wolf, better known in Minnesota as Sheik Adnan El Casey, in 1969 beating Kurt and Carl von Steiger. Carlos Colon won the Universal title for the 25th time, which had been held up, on November 27 in Guaynabo beating Ray Gonzalez in a match where both his 19-year-old son Carly and El Exotico interfered. Carly debuted beating Exotico the previous night and had his second pro match earlier on that show. Most of the house show main events now are father and on against Gonzalez and Exotico. Harley Lewis beat El Nene on November 20th in Kiev, Puerto Rico to win the Puerto Rican Championship. Rico Suave, Julio Estrada, who manages Lewis, now claims he's the owner of the belt. Invader I and Maelo Huertas remain WWC Tag Champs. Jacques Rougeau has his next show at the Pierre Charbonneau Center in Montreal on December 29th with himself, Brother Raymond, King Kong Bundy, Tito Santana, Kurgan, Earthquake John Tenta, Bushwhackers and Ron and Jimmy Garvin. MMA TV Tokyo, Channel 12 in Tokyo and a new company called Coliseum 2000 are trying to put together a Tokyo Dome match between Rickson Gracie and Masakatsu Funaki. A press conference has been scheduled for December 15th to announce the match, which would take place either in March, April or June, depending upon how everything is worked out, but it has the marquee appeal to draw, if hyped correctly, more than 30,000 fans and a huge television rating. Both are well past their fighting prime and Funaki has actually never beaten anyone of real note under Vale Tudo rules. Those who fought him in his prime, which is probably about 4 years ago, and these are people who have fought at the highest level like the Shamrocks, Boss Rutan and Guy Mesger, will say at the time he was among the best if not the best submission fighter around, but every change in the rules changes the fight, and a great Pancrase fighter from 4 years ago can't necessarily make the transition into being a great Vale Tudo fighter today. Even though both are past their prime, Funaki is 30, but he's been in a lot of wars, and Gracie is 40, and in something like this, that is also always a factor. All that doesn't matter from a business standpoint because the fight has great name appeal. Unlike Takada, Funaki is a credible opponent as well as being a big name, and has a chance of winning. How good a chance is subject for debate, but clearly a chance, and if I was guessing going in, conditioning will probably play the biggest factor, which means who is best prepared and whose body is the least injured in the month leading up to the match will be the one with the advantage, as will the rules agreed to determine a lot. Gracie's experience advantage in these rules is also something that has to be taken into consideration. ECW. Dusty Rhodes debuted on the December 2nd TNN tapings in Atlanta at the Tabernacle before a sellout 2,000 fans. Before the show, Joey Styles announced that Rhodes was there but couldn't appear on television for legal reasons, just a work to make people think he wasn't going to do an angle later. Steve Corino was running him down, which led to Rhodes giving Corino and Jack Victory the bionic elbows, and he laid Corino out with an elbow drop. Rhodes is scheduled to work a few TV tapings. The idea he was presented with was to build to a tag match, probably on pay-per-view, although at this point not scheduled for the next one, with Rhodes and Dreamer versus Terry Funk and Raven. There were also rumors all week regarding Shawn Michaels coming to ECW. Obviously he won't be wrestling. According to Raven on the Observer show, the deal was basically up to whether McMahon would allow Michaels to come. It's more likely to be a one-shot deal for pay-per-view, or an angle and pay-per-view rather than any chance of a full-time gig. At press time, neither Heyman nor Michaels had even contacted WWF to make the request for a one-time appearance, but a request was expected to be made to the WWF later this week. Heyman and Michaels also had yet to talk, although Pete Polacco, just incredible, has talked with Michaels for ECW. Within WWF and WCW there are similar reactions to both, largely the feeling they are using ECW to get back on TV. In the case of Rhodes, the feeling is he knows, probably correctly, that the stronger he gets over in ECW, the quicker WCW will rehire him, and Paul Heyman as much as acknowledged, figuring it's a short-term deal until he goes back to WCW. In the case of Michaels, if he even does this, it's his ticket back on television, because right now Michaels has heat with most of management and many of the top wrestlers including Austin, Undertaker, and Rock, that the company hasn't even been bringing him to television even though they send him his $15,000 per week paycheck. Super Calo also debuted in Atlanta having a hot match with Super Crazy, but he injured his tailbone the next night and was on crutches at press time, but was still determined to be in the ring this weekend. It appears Calo is in full time. Too Cold Scorpio also came in, and they put Jazz with him, on the show, losing to Mike Awesome in what was said to have been Awesome's best ECW match since the Masato Tanaka pay-per-view match. Scorpio only worked Atlanta, so it was probably more of a look, and at this point there are no future plans with him as he's all Japan bound. Tracy Smothers and Tommy Rich were in, with Rich managing Smothers against Rob Van Dam. Smothers and Rich usually work when ECW does southern tours. The match was said to be hurt by a run-in by Sabu because it took 3 tries before Sabu put Van Dam through a table. Also in the top matches, Justin Credible beat Sandman due to interference from Rhino and Lance Storm, and they ended with Mahoney and New Jack and Rotten beating whomever with the Baldies this week, which included New Jack doing another balcony dive. He actually messed up his hip on the dive in Buffalo but was still working, but this dive hurt the back even worse and he missed the rest of the weekend and may be out a week or two. In Warner Robins, Georgia on December 3rd on a show described as a lot of comedy, Van Dam and Spike Dudley were said to have had one of the best ECW matches of the year. The January 9th pay-per-view looks to be coming from Birmingham, Alabama. No matches are announced, but Heyman is going with the idea he's going to do his regular 80,000 buys no matter what is advertised, so is mainly looking to load the lineup with good matches or angles to lead to things down the road. Yoshihiro Tajiri was off this weekend as he was already back in Japan to work FMW this week. Crazy will be there with him next week. Sabu didn't work as he was still selling the bad leg from the Van Dam angle on TV. Among the people backstage at the show in Atlanta were Ron Race, Amy Crawford, former Nitro girl AC Jazz, and Ray Lloyd, Glacier Buzz Stern, the latter of whom came with Rhodes. The TNN show on December 3rd was one of the best shows the company has put on from a production standpoint. Show opened with Styles and Gertner in the ring. Gertner got a huge pop for his double entendres when Credible and Storm came out for an interview. Condito and Rhino came out and they did a pull-apart, which the crowd first booed at how quickly security broke them up, but it left the middle of the ring clear for the first cat fight. Throughout the show they aired clips building up to Corino's confrontation with Limp Bizkit. Corino did a great job on this segment. It ended up on stage, where the crowd was 10 times more live for this angle than any pro wrestling crowd is for the hottest angle you've ever seen. Corino and Fred Durst, lead singer, were going back and forth. Finally Balls Mahoney gave him a chair shot and he juiced. Actually New Jack hit him first with an object, which wasn't supposed to happen, but somebody went into business for themselves. To Mahoney's credit, he clearly took care of him, because to that audience which isn't used to chair shots, they didn't need a balls Mahoney chair shot to get the angle over. Axel Rotten, who delivered the second chair shot, wasn't nearly as protective of Corino, as he barely held anything back. That angle was the focal point of the show, and Corino did a great job, to the point of mentioning ECW and Friday nights on TNN on stage. The first match aired was Crazy vs. Ikuto Hidaka. We mistakenly in last week's issue said this match from ECW Arena was Tajiri vs. Hidaka. Since Hidaka physically looks like nothing, the crowd at first taunted him with the egg roll stuff. Hey morons, egg rolls are Chinese food. China and Japan aren't the same country. After the first high spot, the crowd was totally into Hidaka and the match. Hidaka looked a little green, but he's a really top-notch athlete, and 1 year from now will be a great worker. He did this springboard off the middle rope into an implant DDT, which is one of the greatest DDTs of all time. He also snapped off a hell of a Frankensteiner. Crazy did his part, winning in 6:05 with a moonsault. This was better than all but one match on the last WWF and WCW pay-per-view combined. The other match was Sandman vs. Raven with Dreamer as ref. The best part of the match was Raven's pre-match interview. They brought up the years ago angle where Raven was supposedly with Sandman's wife. The match wasn't as bad as I'd been led to believe, but passable would be the nicest thing you could say for it. Basically, Raven bladed, the guys didn't do much and everyone in the world ran in. Condito and Rhino were in first, with Rhino spearing Dreamer and then spearing Sandman through a vertical table. Lori Fullington, Sandman's wife, came out. They teased she'd side with Raven, but instead gave Raven a low blow. For no logical reason, Francine ran out. Oh yeah, both were wearing these ultra-short dresses and 19-inch high-heel boots, and they rolled around on the ground. Fullington is really skinny, but next to Francine, she looked like Rhonda Singh. Personally, I thought they were the most talented athletes on the entire show just for their ability to walk in those boots. Francine gave Lori Fullington a real bad DDT. Credible and Storm came in to beat up Dreamer, then Credible caned Raven. Why would he helping Sandman? Allowing Sandman to win in 9:08. The syndicated hardcore show was also taped from the arena. They had an interview with During, clearly trying to push he and Roadkill up the ladder. Nova and Kid Cash, David Cash, no longer with blonde hair and with a new gimmick, so he's no longer a Ricky Morton lookalike, beat the Dub Brothers. Bo constantly picks his butt and keeps sniffing his hands. And wouldn't you know it, Jack now picks his nose. This gimmick makes it impossible to take anything they do seriously. But it's clear Bo, who used to wrestle as Otto Schwanz in the Carolinas, has a lot of potential, as he's really quick and takes great bumps and looks on TV to be about 6'5", but apparently he's closer to 6'2" and just looked that tall because Nova and particularly Cash are so short. Cash was the best of the four. Dick Kroll, who was a Madison Square Garden ref in the days of Bruno Sammartino, did this bout. Cash did a great flip dive. Nova and Cash did a lot of creative moves. Chetty showed up and threw some great kicks for no apparent reason other than to make an appearance. Nova pinned Jack with the Kryptonite Crunch in 9:47. James Mitchell, WCW's James Vandenberg, had a conversation with Don Callis. He said he'd do a priest gimmick. Callis told him the owner was Jewish. Mitchell said he'd get a Yamaha, I think that's what he said, and put it on his head. They replayed the open with the Credible and Storm brawl with Condito and Rhino from TNN. Storm and Credible then cut a promo on Condito and Rhino, which wasn't too bad until that lame catchphrase ending. Finally, Van Dam beat Uganda in about 11 minutes. Sabu was on stage on crutches selling the injury angle from the previous week. Van Dam was running him down, calling him fragile and saying Sabu was the Sheik's second favorite wrestler. Van Dam did a running flip dive and followed with a running somersault senton over the guardrail onto the Fat Man. He ended up on the stage and Sabu hit him with a chair, and Sabu jumped off the top level of stage at the ECW arena onto Uganda on the middle level through a table, and Sabu rolled off that nice round target midsection off the middle level to the bottom level. Fonzie kept the two guys apart. Van Dam won with his Vandaminator and the splash about February 3rd of the way across the ring. A correction. The Limp Bizkit concert on November 20th in Peoria that ECW did the angle with didn't draw 16,000 fans, as the building only holds 8,000. MTV News played the angle on its regular rotation in midweek and plugged that the entire angle would air on the TNN show. WCW Ric Flair's attorneys requested him getting a release from his contract, but at this point WCW hasn't agreed to it. TV 14 Nitro on December 6 in Milwaukee drew 7,250 fans, which was 6,063 paying $162,717. The Night of a Billion Angles opened with Jarrett doing an interview. The censors tried, with little success, to edit out the fans' chants of asshole. Finally they gave up in futility. They set up Jarrett versus Dustin Rhodes in a bunkhouse match at Starrcade. The Chosen One challenged Hart, Goldberg and Mike Tenay, and threatened to clock that aging pervert Gene Okerlund with a guitar. Finally Tenay did the run-in. It looked like he was more serious than 99% of the wrestlers doing their angles. After arguing, Tenay turned his back, and Jarrett jumped him and put him in the figure 4 until Goldberg made the save to set up the main event. There were a million segments with Disco, LaRue, Vito and Johnny the Bull and Tony Maranera sauce. Basically Maranera was mad at his bumbling idiots for being bumbling idiots. They were supposed to take out Disco and Lash, but somehow got sidetracked into playing a strip poker game with the Nitro girls. Didn't we just see a poker game angle on Raw last week? Anyway, those Nitro girls were cheating, and in the interest of upping the ratings with the all-important male 12 and 34 demo, we got to see Vito and Johnny strip throughout the show. While this was going on, Disco and Lash kidnapped Maranera Sauce and tied him up. Didn't we see this on Raw, and wasn't it a lot more dramatic there? And tarred, well actually syruped, and feathered him. I know we saw that with Finkel on Raw, but actually the tar and feather gimmick goes back to Southern wrestling since the beginning of time. Fit Finlay is now playing Sergeant and training Private Knobs in the art of something or other. Smiley beat Rhonda Singh in a hardcore match in 308. They hit each other with garbage cans. Smiley was going to do it doggy style, but Singh sprayed him with a fire extinguisher. Didn't we see that on Raw last week? Smiley finally got the pin. David Flair kidnapped Symphony. Maestro spent the whole show looking for him, and in the process got his ass kicked in the block by Jerry Flynn. Russo decided in a manner to decide who would be IWGP Junior Heavyweight Champion that the belt would go to whomever got out the door between Psicosis and La Parka, who probably doesn't qualify as a junior heavyweight to begin with, but these Mexicans are all the same anyway. Psicosis got out the door, and came to the ring holding the IWGP Junior title. This reminds me of something a Japanese writer told me probably 15 years ago about when angles are really stupid. He said wrestling is like the circus. They come to town and they leave a mess. But they leave town and it's the town that has to clean up the mess. He said the reporter's job is like the town, trying to figure out ways to clean up the mess of the booking that they do without thinking how things look. Liger won the belt with La Magistral in 458. It was a good match. Not that anyone cared, because even if they would, they made sure that the focus of the fans was on Brad Armstrong in the stands holding a sign. Immediately at the finish, Parka hit Psicosis with a chair. Jean looked down Mona's top. She scolded him for doing so, saying she's an athlete or something like that. Like the purpose of her ring outfit is purely for athletics. Actually, the roller jam angle on Friday, which was the same thing, was a lot funnier. Medusa won the three-way over Mona and Evan Karagias in 126. Karagias was at ringside doing commentary, letting the girls go at it. As Medusa was in trouble, Karagias ran in for the save, but Medusa pinned him to earn the title match. It would have made more sense if last week she hadn't gotten Karagias to give her a title match, wanting no doubt to resurrect the prestige of the once great cruiserweight belt, while letting him do what his imagination desired. In the storyline at least, he hasn't slept with her and all the fans know he's being worked. Williams and Oklahoma beat Vampiro and Jerry only in 435. Oklahoma, who has a physique definitely made for writing and not performing wrestling matches, did his own commentary, which was funny, especially when 30 seconds into the match he let on that he was already blown up. He hit only with a chair so he couldn't screw up the match too badly. Oklahoma at least looked like a beginning indie wrestler, as opposed to only who looked like someone who is 1 year away from his first pro match. Oklahoma hit Vampiro with his cowboy boot, Williams planted Vampiro and Oklahoma pinned him after an elbow drop off the bottom rope. He went to the middle rope, got scared, and came down. Oklahoma then got his cowboy hat back that Vampiro took on Thunder. Hart beat Luger with a sharpshooter to keep the title in 356. Liz and Sting were at ringside. Sting told Liz she had to make a decision between him and Luger. She chose Sting. Luger was distracted and beaten quickly. At this point in the show they played the exact same segment they played earlier in the show where Hennig tried to get Curly Bill a job with Russo, and suggested a new gimmick Shane. Russo hated the gimmick. Actually, he hated it twice. So, of course, later in the show, Virgil Vincent St. Michael Curly Bill Jones was performing under what name? That production crew is almost as much of a nightmare as the attendants at house shows these days.
Russo told Parker to be his chairman, so whomever he tells him to, he hits with a chair.
Heat came in. Parker and Creative Control beat them up with chair shots. This was starting to look like Glow by this point.
I guess those who don't know history have no idea how long that show lasted.
Douglas did an interview. The crowd chanted asshole. The censor guy tried again but gave up again.
Asya no contest midnight in about 2:30.
Midnight is a million times better athlete than China.
Actually, so is Asya, but since neither has had much wrestling training, this ranged from good athletics to real bad work and overall was horrible.
The Revolution attacked Midnight. He didn't make the save. Instead, it was Duggan, and at least his 2x4 this week wasn't foam rubber. They ended up beating up Duggan with his own 2x4 and buried him under the flag of their sovereign nation.
They introduced Daphne Unger as a crazed female who has a crush on David Flair, who apparently is going to end up stalking him under the guise of a Nitro party video.
Piper beat both members of Creative Control, which he called Condom Heads, in an I Quit match in 226, which he was also the ref of. Piper grabbed both of their balls in searching them. The crowd thought that was funny. Goldberg came out and speared and tried to jackhammer Ron. I don't know what went wrong, but Goldberg lost the guy big time, and I thought for a second both were going to kill themselves. Fans booed this. Goldberg finally managed to slam one twin and Piper choked the other twin with his tie and he quit.
How come Piper isn't the World Tag Team Champions by himself?
Piper then raised Goldberg's hand after the match. Rhodes beat Meng via DQ in 114 when Jarrett interfered.
Rhodes set up Shattered Dreams on Jarrett, but Hall and Nash saved him.
Jarrett hit Meng with a guitar which he half sold, and Nash gave him a high kick and he sold the other half. Nash gave Rhodes a power bomb.
Zbyszko and Russo did an interview which was hilarious on many levels. Russo said that Thunder stinks.
Zbyszko said it stinks because none of the big-name talent ever appears on the show.
Russo said all the top stars would be on Thunder starting this week, naming Goldberg, Hall, Nash, Sting and Hart, but said the announcing on Thunder stinks.
Zbyszko overacts so much that he's amazingly like William Shatner. I swear I was expecting a Priceline.com commercial to start. Anyway, they set up a match where if Zbyszko wins, Russo has to go back to WWF, and if Hennig wins, Zbyszko has to leave WCW.
Actually, that match, if built up for about 2 months, could mean something on pay-per-view, but they instead did it in the very next segment.
They started building the new gimmick for Mike Hayner, whose ring name will become the artist formerly known as Prince Iokea. Hennig beat Zbyszko via DQ in 357. The former Vincent was at ringside, now called Shane. I thought Russo hated that idea. Zbyszko isn't out of shape for a 45-year-old guy, but he had a lot of ring rust. After a ref bumped, Zbyszko got Hennig in a guillotine choke. Yeah, like you think the announcers knew what the hell that was. Heenan was so far gone the entire show it was ridiculous. Shane interfered. Arn Anderson ran in and hit Hennig and Shane with a bat and Zbyszko got the pin. Creative Control told Charles Robinson to watch the video wall and when he saw it, he DQ'd Zbyszko. So Zbyszko is off announcing. Nash no contest Benoit in 644.
Hall came out and did color while sitting on the top of a ladder.
He claimed to have invented ladder matches. Heenan claimed that Hall had never lost a ladder match. Luckily Heenan forgot about the match he called in January with Goldberg. He shouldn't have. It was one of the few decent WCW main events on pay-per-view all year.
There was one hilarious line. Shuvani asked Hall what he was doing with the ladder and Hall told him that he should look because he's got the format sheet in front of him.
Benoit got the crossface.
Hall hit ref Mark Johnson with the ladder. Benoit dropkicked the ladder into Nash and did a plancha off the ladder onto Hall. Nash gave Benoit a high kick and powerbomb and Hall set up the edge when Sid came out to save Benoit.
Flynn beat up Maestro in the block. You could hear the fans booing this one heavily. As Flynn was going to leave the block, David Flair hit him with the crowbar.
Sting beat Hall with a scorpion in 609 when Liz maced Hall. There was a kid who looked to be about 8 in the front row who kept waving a sign at Liz saying, "Show me your puppies." She saw it and seemed to momentarily be concerned.
David Flair came out, still holding Symphony hostage. DDP came out and gave Flair a diamond cutter and then talked about rumors of him going to the WWF. He didn't say anything, but tried to intimate they weren't true. He also was careful not to bury WWF.
Basically the situation was that he went to Paul White and Ray Traylor and asked both to pass the message he was interested in coming in.
The message was given back that they couldn't come anywhere close to guaranteeing him the money he was making in WCW. Page then wrestled Sid, which lasted about 1 minute before the worst ref bump of the night.
Nash and Hall come out.
Fans chanted for Goldberg. Hart came in.
Jarrett came in.
They still wanted Goldberg. Security came in and the fans booed.
Nick Patrick and security then all left. The refs were going on strike.
What a novel idea. Piper said he'd ref the Goldberg vs. Jarrett main event and it would be a lumberjack match. Jarrett did a good job and this was the only match on the show to have any heat. Jarrett tried to leave at one point and 3 members of the Green Bay Packers including Gilbert Brown chased him back. Everyone was interfering. Jarrett hit Goldberg with 2 chair shots but Goldberg kicked out, to a nice pop.
Hart hit Jarrett with the title belt. Goldberg speared Jarrett and went to jackhammer him and again, nearly lost him at 7:14.
Add this one to Starrcade, the Revolution vs. the Varsity Club.
Who are the Varsity Club?
Jim Duggan, Mike Rotunda, Rick Steiner, and Kevin Sullivan. Steve Williams may wind up back with that bunch at some point as well. That a reprise of a 1988 angle in the old NW where Sullivan managed a group of ex-collegiate athletes who were heels and Steiner was always picked on, which led to a babyface turn, which for a brief period he was the most popular wrestler in the company. It'll probably be a middle-aged comedy Varsity Club that didn't grow up, since Steiner, University of Michigan wrestler way back when, is 38. Rotunda, University of Syracuse wrestler/football player, is 41 and Duggan, SMU football star, is 45. The way the angle for Starrcade is supposed to go is that the Varsity Club faces the Revolution in some form with the losing team having to work at Nitro as janitors, you know. The Duggan role, leading to Douglas Malenko and Saturn being janitors. The Benoit vs. Hall US title match at Starrcade will be a ladder match. Hall got 3.5 stars out of Goldberg last year in one of those, although to the best of my knowledge, Benoit has never done a ladder match in his career. Also David Flair vs. DDP in a tire iron on a pole match, and in the Williams vs. Vampiro match, if Vampiro wins, he gets 5 minutes with Oklahoma. The Creative Control vs. Harlem Heat tag title match has been changed to a 6-man with Kurt Hennig on one side and Midnight on the other, but the tag team titles are still at stake because not having them at stake in a 6-man would make sense, and we can't have any of that out of wrestling, can we? Thunder on December 2nd in Topeka, Kansas was a largely boring series of uneventful matches and even worse skits.
Check out the finishes, because I think they were just about all the same.
Smiley beat Wall in a hardcore title match in 2:35 when Berlin hit Wall with the belt.
Actually, Berlin missed the belt shot on him badly, but since it was the finish, Wall sold it anyway.
Boy, was that bad. Cause Hayashi did an interview where they voiced over the guy talking English.
Wasn't that La Parka's gimmick?
Hayashi beat Maestro in 3:42 when David Flair showed up after a ref bump. The fans did groan. I mean, a ref bump when Hayashi wrestles Maestro? Flair hit Hayashi with the tire iron and Maestro saw Flair and ran away, probably thinking if he stayed they might book him in a wrestling match with David on a pay-per-view. Buzzkill beat Chavo Guerrero Jr. in 34 after hitting him with Chavo's own briefcase.
This was beyond lame and the crowd hated it.
First off, Tony Schiavone acted as if this was Buzzkill's first match in WCW, even though everyone knew it was Brad Armstrong doing this 60s stoned hippie gimmick, which worked wonders for Mike Boyette when such a thing was a modern gimmick. Buzzkill came out to entrance music exactly like his brother Road Dogg. He did a few of his mannerisms and tried to develop some catchphrases. Chavo tried to sell him some tie-dyed t-shirts and a psychedelic lamp in the ring. Fans hated this.
After the match, Buzzkill grabbed money from ref Mark Johnson and gave it to Chavo and left with a lamp. So Chavo woke up and was happy that he made the sale. At this point, the Buzzkill gimmick has been a real flop. One of the reasons they are repeating the same gimmick that had just been used unsuccessfully for Van Hammer is that the new creative team had never watched WCW before and didn't even know Hammer had ever done that gimmick. Vito and Johnny put a guy in a freezer. Williams beat Silver King and Villanos 4 and 5-3 on 1 and 147 when Williams gave the Oklahoma Stampede to V4. Silver King left with the $10,000 piñata match check and ran away during the match, leaving his partners, and hopped into a taxi that Luger had called since he was so afraid of wrestling Sid Vicious, as if it would be any worse than any of his other matches, running past Luger and left. Liger no contest Benoit in 7:18. Really good. Guerrero did color commentary using a few of Rock and Jericho's catchphrases, and boy was he pissed legit at Liger. Guerrero made remarks calling him unprofessional, and when Benoit caught Liger on a plancha, he talked about how that showed Benoit was a true professional unlike Liger. I wonder what the people at home were thinking about all that. He called Liger a con man, apparently because of Liger's rep as one of the greatest workers of all time, and was ripping on the match, even though the match was better than anything WCW has had on television since that tag match Hoovy had on Thunder, which was a match of the year that nobody saw or remembers. Mike Tenay brought up that this was a great match,
And Hoovy basically remarked he has matches non-stop like it every night he's out there.
The finish saw Parka and Psychosis interfere and Benoit and Liger work together in cleaning house. Really lame finish, although by this point you could say that about every match on the show.
Disco and LaRue outsmarted Vito and Johnny by removing the sign from Meng's dressing room that read Meng and putting Disco and Lash on it. Vito and Johnny went in and Meng beat them up.
Seeing as how totally incompetent Vito and Johnny are at just about everything, why are Disco and Lash so damn worried?
Meng beat Bagwell. Vito and Johnny came out again. There was a ref bump. As Meng was beating on Vito, Buff went up for the blockbuster, but instead gave it to Vito. Meng then put the Tongan death grip on Bagwell in 5 minutes. Gene interviewed Jarrett and Mona. Jarrett didn't even want to be near them.
Gene kept looking at Mona's boobs like a dirty old man and Mona made reference to it.
I think that was the only reason they even gave her an interview. Karages and Medusa beat Mona and Jarrett. Jarrett never even tagged in.
Mona got beat up until Evan gave her the screw, which is actually an Ultimo Dragon move, but if Russo and Ferrara knew the actual name of the move, Evan would probably get a push and be using it on women every week. Jarrett hit Mona with a guitar after.
Luckily this isn't the WWF where they do things like that. Zbyszko, in the lame comment of the year, said that the guitar was loaded with weights when it was already broken and it was so obviously hollow. Malenko and Saturn beat Disco and Lash. Vito and Johnny came out here and were run off by Malenko and Saturn. Finish at 4:09 saw Douglas hit LaRue with the cast and Malenko use the cloverleaf. Those lame names like Boa that were given to these guys the previous Monday have already been dropped, but they are still anti-Americans to feud with Duggan. Finally Luger, who kept wanting to run away from Sid until he found out he'd get a title shot if he won, beat Sid in 2:25 of a lame match. Liz came out to spray Mace at Lex, but he closed his eyes, grabbed the bottle and sprayed Sid. Sid the big dummy didn't learn from Lex's brilliant move and kept his eyes open. Sid did power bomb him after the match.
Ric Flair asked for his release but the company doesn't want to let him go.
Guerrero will be most likely undergoing surgery for a dislocated elbow and possible bone chips in the elbow from landing on it doing a springboard plancha in the match with Jushin Liger on November 29 in Denver. He was to be examined this week for the final word on whether or not he needs surgery. He didn't miss the December 6 Nitro due to the injury, but because he had a court date in State College, Pennsylvania on the DUI and resisting arrest charges. As a rib, since Rock on a Jericho interview a few months back talked about having wrestled some guy named Juventud Guerrera over the weekend in Texas in his Mexican accent said, "Finally, the juice has come back too." And the place went nuts and started chanting his name. There are people who think he should now make that part of his repertoire.
Most guys would come off unbelievably lame trying to rip off Rock, and some have already.
Guerrera, because he's so unintentionally funny and also so talented, is about the only guy who could pull it off. And lastly on this week's Juventud Guerrera Observer, the woman whose life he saved, doing the Heimlich maneuver he picked up by watching Thunder on Thanksgiving night, was Leilani Kai. Tori Wilson on her website said that she's still negotiating and wants to work out a deal to return to WCW, but by the end of the week it appeared the odds were lessening that it would happen.
Apparently the deal made with her was for $3,000 per Nitro appearance plus first-class tickets, except for the top wrestlers. Most of the guys fly coach. When they wanted to make her a regular character and work Tuesdays as well for Thunder, by the old deal, that would be $6,000 per week. So WCW offered her a new contract on a per-year basis, which worked out to considerably less than $6,000 per week, which of course, her side took as a pay cut while WCW considered that they were giving her a raise, which led to the impasse. There were talks with WWF, but the internet stories of those talks were way overplayed as there were stories out before there even were talks. Anyway, apparently after there were talks, she was leaning toward returning and expected to sign by the end of the week. The basic reports close to the situation say that WWF's offer was less than WCW's offer, which would be consistent with that we'd expect under the situation to be the case. William Morris reported has struck a high six-figure book deal for Bill Goldberg, which apparently will be written largely by Brother Steve. The New York Daily News on December 7 reported the book is the start of larger ambitions with WCW. It's interesting that Mick Foley got no advance for his book, which opened so many eyes regarding wrestling books. The Foley book was obviously a unique situation, and it'll be interesting to see if the Rock book and Austin book, that more likely than not won't be of anywhere near the same caliber, can do anywhere near the business. In particular Austin, because by the time that book comes out, while he won't be out of sight, out of mind, he also will have been out of the ring and main events for months.
They're going to add a whole new batch of Nitro girls to feud with the other Nitro girls. Add David Taylor and High Voltage to the list of guys dropped by WCW.
Robbie Rage had a lot of potential.
He never returned after tearing his bicep.
Paul Heyman was always high on him as well.
One of the internal beliefs is that Russo and Ferrara are booking entirely for the internet. Russo on the show said except for the angle with Bagwell having to lay down for La Parka that he doesn't believe a casual fan wouldn't understand their angles, although he was said to have loved Guerrera's commentary on Liger, and I wouldn't have even had a clue what that was all about if I hadn't been told about it. At the shows, the two are always looking for internet response to everything they do and have Bill Banks immediately report initial reactions.
There were also people in the company who noted that Banks didn't even know who Jushin Liger was before he came and thought that the promotion he worked for was called the IWGP, an era that made its way all the way to the WCW website. The November 28th house show in Midland, Texas drew 1,579, paying $33,840.
The final WCW Saturday night taping on November 30th in Vail, Colorado drew 1,240, paying $28,528. December 1st in Lincoln, Nebraska drew a solid crowd of 4,150, paying $93,795. Thunder on December 2nd in Topeka, Kansas drew 2,384 paid, plus 2,467 comps given out, for $52,662. December 3rd in Salina, Kansas drew 1,689, paying $36,052.
December 4th in Cedar Rapids, Iowa drew 2,010, paying $55,432, and December 5th in Chicago, United Center drew 5,084, plus 4,204 comps, paying $198,158.
We don't have complete merchandise figures for the past 8 days, but of what we do have they are selling at a $5.80 per head clip. Lincoln was headlined by Hart vs. Flair for the title, which, as noted, is a match with no TV help. Salina, despite the small crowd in a market where a promotion with such strong national television as WCW should be able to sell out in, these house show crowds are really indicative of just how cold the product really is, was said to be a pretty good show with Hart over Sting and Benoit over Flair as the top two matches. Cedar Rapids was the same basic lineup. Liger worked the December 3rd to December 5th house show run beating Psychosis to get ready for their Nitro match.
In Chicago, they brought in a lot of unadvertised talent to do run-ins.
Vito and Johnny, who weren't advertised, to attack Disco after his loss to Hennig.
Benoit beat Flair in a 20 minutes match and Vicious pinned Steiner in the next match, which went 2 minutes and was said to be a worst match of the year candidate.
Sting beat Luger.
Luger said he had stomach cramps and couldn't wrestle. Sting then pulled a bottle of Pepto-Bismol out of his bag and dumped it all over Luger. Luger wrestled the entire match with Pepto-Bismol all over his hair and chest. Liz came out and slapped Luger at the finish, setting up Sting, putting him away. The first Hart-Goldberg WCW title match, the fact this match only drew 5,084 paid in a 20,000-seat building in what has been the hottest wrestling city in the country over the past 2 years speaks volumes about how much heat is on the feud at this point,
ended when Hall and Nash interfered. The ref ruled it a no contest. Hart got on the mic and said fans didn't come here to see such a bad finish and wanted the match restarted. So a few minutes later, Hall, Nash and Jarrett all interfered. Jarrett his Goldberg with a chair shot, which he sold, much to the chagrin of the crowd. Hart, who was out of the ring and didn't see it, came back in and put the sharpshooter on him and the match was stopped. Goldberg jackhammered Jarrett to end the show.
Insane Clown Posse is claiming they'll be back on the December 13th Nitro in New Orleans.
The plan seems to be for Piper to wind up going heel in his ref role.
Several WCW wrestlers were named in a December 7th New York Daily News article on the indictment of the Gold Club, a popular strip club in Atlanta which is known for its regular clientele of pro athletes.
The owner of the club, Stephen Kaplan, was indicted last month on charges that the club served as a skimming operation for millions of dollars for the mob. Kaplan was listed as a close associate of the Gambino crime family.
The 97-page indictment said Kaplan provided strippers on numerous occasions to perform oral sex on unnamed NBA players.
None of the players were named in the indictment and none of the athletes, or the pro wrestlers, were charged with any crime.
The newspaper received Gold Club records seized by federal agents, which listed the club as comping booze and free strip shows to NBA stars such as Patrick Ewing, Dennis Rodman and Charles Oakley, along with WCW wrestlers Randy Savage, Diamond Dallas Page, Scott Steiner, and Perry Saturn.
Hart in his November 27 Calgary Sun column, at least the unedited version, largely appeared to be him preparing the local fans for his expected heel turn, saying that if the powers that be want him to do something stupid, he told readers don't take it too seriously. The plan seems to be along the lines of him going back to his 1997 role, which was his most successful role of his career as far as being a true drawing card, but he himself doesn't want to go back to actually insulting the US and playing strong anti-American. In regarding taking wrestling so seriously, as he was often criticized for in the past and has agreed that he probably did, he said that I don't anymore.
Wrestling has changed and so have I. He said that being champion doesn't mean anything anymore except for the bone on your check, that the title matches often aren't even the main event and take a backseat to the soap opera scene of the week. He noted that fans have pointed in that they believe he's a hypocrite because he was outspoken when the WWF took the direction it did, but he hasn't spoken out against the WCW going in the same direction. He said that times have changed and so has he. I think sometimes some of you want me to speak out against the same stuff you tune in and enjoy watching. Time after time, fans tell me that they don't like the lewd and crude direction that wrestling has gone, and in the same breath they go on to give me a blow-by-blow description of everything happening on the shows. Now who is being hypocritical? His December 4th column was largely praising Steve Austin, saying he thought Austin was a hell of a lot better than Shawn Michaels. He seemed despondent that so many of the guys, mentioning himself, Austin, Undertaker, Savage, Kurt Hennig and Mick Foley, are winding down their careers at about the same time, and wondered who would be left to carry on the art of pro wrestling as they knew it besides Chris Benoit, saying for him it'll be lonely at the top because it takes two to dance. He talked about WCW going down the same road as WWF, saying, when they can't play can you top this anymore, and they need to rely on solid wrestling for their main events, there won't be anyone there to carry on. We're at the point where classic matches will be fewer and fewer until they fade away forever. Watch them while you can. Hidden in the hoopla of ratings generated by a new breed of fans who choose soap opera over sport, few people notice or even care that wrestling as I know it and as longtime fans know it, is about to die. Former WCW announcer Lee Marshall has taken over an anchor for the morning news on KVEN Radio in Ventura, California. WWF Armageddon pay-per-view lineup will be McMahon vs. Triple H in a Falls Count Anywhere match where if McMahon wins, the marriage is annulled, but if Triple H wins, he gets a title shot at Royal Rumble. That's a safer bet than the stock. Show vs. Bossman for the WWF title. Outlaws vs. Rock and Mankind for the WWF tag titles. Kane vs. X-Pac. Chyna vs. Jericho for the IC title. A European title match with Venus vs. Bulldog, which is likely to turn into a three-way with Brown. Hollies vs. Viscera and Rikishi Fatu. Angle vs. Blackman, a evening gown match with Ivory, Miss Kitty, Barbara Bush, a guest designed to get fans to chant "We want Bush," and Jacqueline, plus a tag team battle royal with Hardys, Edge, and Christian, Headbangers, Dudleys, Acolytes, Taka and Funaki, and another team. December 6th Raw from the Worcester Centrum drew a sellout 10,526 paying $289,029. Road Dogg did his catchphrase, Shiznit became poo-poo and Doggy Style became Doggy Chow. Outlaws no contest Too Cool in a tag title match in 323 when Christopher leg dropped Dog off the top but the Hollies ran in. Bob DDT'd Rikishi on a chair. Rikishi is going to be getting something of a push because the crowd pops big when he and Too Cool do the dance. Gunn gave Taylor a jackhammer after. Mankind did an interview and called out Snow. Definitely Snow's best performance since coming to the WWF. He came out without the head and did nothing comedic. It seemed Foley was trying to address people critical of him for using comedy, noting that he's staying over without getting hurt, and people who say he should retire. Snow said he threw the book in the garbage and attacked Foley and they had a pull apart. Stephanie told Vince she'd had it. Angle and Blackman beat the Hardys in 150 when Blackman hit Jeff with his stick and Angle pinned him. Angle acted as if he did it himself and he was carrying Blackman. Matt had a real bad short match, tripping on one spot, missing another and throwing real bad looking punches. Stephanie tried to get Triple H to sign an annulment. He wanted her to go in the shower with him. The fans in the background were popping for Triple H as the face at this point as he made fun of her. Venus NC Brown in 205 when Bulldog and the posse attacked both guys. Rodney used the buff blockbuster on Brown while Bulldog power slammed Venus. Godfather pinned Albert in 345 with a schoolboy. It was funny watching this because the hoes at ringside were the only ones in the building cheering once the bell rang. Triple H came out and did a phenomenal interview. He used the word slut and whore because the fans in Anaheim did in their chants at SmackDown, doing a masterful job of turning Stephanie back babyface. Triple H cried and Stephanie came out. Largely they set up the stips for the match. The fans still were largely cheering Triple H by the end of this. Foley said he'd give Vince advice on how to do a no-holds-barred match. Rikishi bonsai'd Bob Holly in 35 seconds and he and Too Cool danced after. All the women in the evening gown match were yelling at each other. Ivory was real good and the rest were terrible. Chyna told Miss Kitty she had to be in it and Kitty didn't want to, saying that she doesn't wear underwear. Backstage, Viscera splashed Big Show through a table. Triple H and X-Pac beat Kane and Test in 5:23 when Triple H pinned Test after a low blow and pedigree. Test's part in the big angle has been dropped like a hot potato. Show pinned Viscera to keep the WWF title in 2:23. This was amazing because they did spots that should get an easy pop. Viscera did a Samoan drop on Show. No pop. Show with a back suplex. No pop. Viscera did the worst bulldog headlock in wrestling history. Of course no pop. Show body slammed him. There's always a pop when you slam a fat guy. No pop. Show actually tried a missile dropkick for the pin. There's a reason a guy of his size doesn't do missile dropkicks, and when you saw it, you knew why. Bossman was with Show's mom and he found out that his dad that died wasn't his real dad. Geez, we all knew that. I guess his mom will tell him next week that his real dad was Andre. By the way, Foley on Off the Record did say that Paul White didn't like doing an angle that played off his real father's death, but by the end of the angle with Bossman kidnapping the casket they thought it was funny. Show called up his mom and he was really mad about being lied to for 27 years. Geez, she was just training him for life in pro wrestling. Anyway, Paul White had the biggest hands in the human race. Rock and Mankind vs. Jericho and Show went to a no contest in 5 minutes. Jericho was doing a promo when Chyna jumped him. She attacked him way before she was supposed to. Jericho and Show tried a double team missile dropkick that didn't work. Rock used the rock bottom on Jericho on the stage. The Outlaws attacked Rock and Mankind. The show ended with a rock bottom on Gunn, but Snow ran in and hit Foley with the head. The orange figure on the Titantron on both Raw and SmackDown was to build toward the arrival of Taz. SmackDown tapings in Boston on December 7th before the 5th straight Fleet Center sellout. First for Heat, Gangrel beat Papi Chulo in a good opener, particularly the work of Chulo, but fans chanted boring anyway. Mideon pinned Steve Bradley in a terrible match. Mideon painted his tattoos green and had green face paint reminiscent of Jim Hellwig, and he wrestled almost as well. Bangers beat Taka and Funaki. Bangers wore a girdle and pantyhose. Godfather pinned Tom Howard in a match where they screwed up every spot. SmackDown opened with Dog over Jericho in 3:35. Chyna was doing commentary. Jericho first won with the quebrada, but Dog got his leg on the ropes and Chyna told the ref and it was restarted. Dog used the pump handle slam, but Chyna shoved Jericho's leg off the ropes. Test apologized to Stephanie, but Stephanie gave him back his ring and they both cried. They were about to kiss and make up when X-Pac did a run-in. Dudley's beat Angle and Blackman, doing the 3D on Blackman after he and Angle had collided. Angle laid out Blackman after and said Blackman lost the match but he was still undefeated. Bulldog NC Christian in a title match when Posse, Venus and Brown all interfered. Kevin Kelly interviewed Kitty, who started ripping Kelly's clothes off. Albert and Bossman NC Hardys in 1:55 when Show destroyed Albert and Bossman. Mankind beat Snow via DQ in 5:18. Mankind had a chair but refused to use it. Snow low blowed him and hit him with a chair and smashed his head into the chair many times, leaving him laying. They did the contract signing for the Triple H vs. Vince match, ending with Triple H punched Shane and throwing him off the stage. They made a big deal with the EMTs, including BB, playing up Shane being hurt. X-Pac pinned Test after a low blow and X-Factor. Vince stormed off vowing revenge. Rock pinned Gunn in 2:01. Ref bump and Famouser but Rock kicked out. Second ref bump and Rock bottom and elbow and a 3 count. Earl Hebner, who was bumped twice the previous match, came out for the Kane vs. Triple H main event. He got bumped again. A couple of more refs came out, both wearing Vince masks, and they got bumped. Actually, Triple H put Hebner in some sort of leg lock and injured him. After a choke slam, Triple H rolled out and left. This time Vince, wearing a Vince mask, KO'd Triple H with a baseball bat. DX tried to help but he hit all of them with a bat as well until everyone pulled him off. When the show went on the air, DX all hit the ring but Kane destroyed them one by one. Both Ken Shamrock and Undertaker were backstage at the Los Angeles tapings. Shamrock was down in weight and in good shape. He's putting on the U.S. Pancration Championships on January 30th, Super Bowl Sunday, at the San Diego Sports Arena. He'll probably start on either the December 20th or December 27th set of tapings. Undertaker was also backstage.
He's been doing a lot of physical therapy, but he still has a lot of tightness in his groin area, and it's the kind of injury that if you don't let it fully heal, you're risking re-injury. He's not ready to wrestle, but could be back as a character on television as early as this week or next. His first match back will probably be on the December 15th and December 26th shows in Puerto Rico for Victor Quiñones, but isn't expected back in the ring for WWF until around Royal Rumble time. Quiñones will also run a tour from January 5th to January 8th in Puerto Rico before opening up a 4-day-a-week territory probably around January 22nd. Mick Foley and the WWF are talking about extending his career as a regular wrestler and added 2 or so months from the original plan. The plan as of last week was that he'd wrestle through the Royal Rumble and make an announcement at the show that he'd be leaving for a while and come back with his new role sometime down the line. With Austin definitely out of Mania, he's been asked to stay through the big show on April 2nd. They will likely cut down on his house show commitments and booking him in a lot of tag team matches from this point forward where the partner would handle most of the in-ring work. In an example of toning down, X-Pac did an interview on the November 30th SmackDown show where he made allusions to Tori giving him oral sex in the back, obviously not using those words, and they made him go out and cut a new interview. WWF The Music Volume 4 dropped from number 28 to number 41 this past week, even though it actually increased in sales to 72,973 units. That's because the industry itself increased more than 30% over the previous week due to it being the start of the Christmas season. Even that didn't prevent the WCW Mayhem CD from taking a tumble from number 40 in its first week down to number 95 with 29,024 units sold. The belief is on the WCW compilation that word on the street that what's on the CD is largely not entrance music and has little interest to wrestling fans is killing it. Preliminary indicators at press time for next week's chart indicate the WWF album should drop about 17%, which is not good during Christmas season, and that WCW should plummet. House shows for the week was SmackDown November 30th in Anaheim, California draw a sellout 12,344 paying $363,359. Merchandise from the period of November 23rd to November 28th was $404,670 or $6.90 per head. A lot of the merchandise increase in the past month or so is probably because of marketing the Finally The Rock Has Come Back to, insert city, t-shirts which seem to be a huge seller at the house show. Jim Ross and Mike Mooneyham's report on the Wrestling Observer hotline knocked the spoofs on him both when they were done on WWF and WCW television. I never watched the replays of any of that when I was disgruntled, deranged, mentally disturbed, unbalanced, whatever the heck it was they wanted me to be. Russo wanted to turn me heel because he doesn't believe that people with a southern accent have any intelligence and people don't respect individuals with a southern accent. They laid out this plan that I didn't want to do at the time. But you try to be a team player and practice what you preach, so you go along with what management wants to do. If I had not wanted to try to support Russo and Ferrara, I would have gone to Vince McMahon and told him that I wasn't going to do this. And he would have said, "Okay, JR, I understand why you don't want to do it." The WWF-themed restaurant at Times Square was opened for a video shoot on December 2nd for lunch. Apparently the theme is big portions and big prices. Burgers are $11, salads are $11, chicken is $15, and New York steak, 18 ounces, is $27. How's this one? Tony Halme, who wrestled in the WWF as Ludwig Borga and actually was a headliner feuding with Lex Luger during one of the real down periods 4 years ago, and I guess the fact he was pushed as a main eventer probably half explains why it was a down period, will be facing name heavyweight boxer Henry Kimwand, the WBA's #1 contender to Lennox Lewis, on December 18th in Tunica, Mississippi. Halme, who turns 37 in January, and has boxed both in Finland and the United States before breaking in and being a major star, and this is hard to believe as well, with New Japan Pro Wrestling in 1990, got out of pro wrestling and has since done some boxing matches and also did a UFC match where he tapped out to Randy Couture in about 1 minute. Dan Zucker, a childhood friend of Mick Foley, along with Mick Foley are marketing his 1985 The Loved One videotape that spawned the character Dude Love. This low-budget amateur movie includes his backyard match and jump off the roof of Zucker's house as well as scenes of the legend of Frank Foley, 1984. This is the actual movie that got Foley into the door of pro wrestling. For more information you can go to www.thelovedone.com. Rock's book, which will be ghostwritten, is scheduled for release on January 5th. While you have to strike when the iron is hot, and Rock's big push will be coming at that point, because the Foley book was so hard to get for so long and not even all that easy to get now, it's too soon to put out a second book.
The May UK pay-per-view show from Earl's Court in London sold out about 13,000 tickets in 6 hours.
Naohito Morishita, the president of Dream Stage Entertainment, had a brief meeting with WWF officials on November 30th in Anaheim and had a second meeting on December 1st with Bruce Pritchard and Victor Quiñones. The basics of the meeting is that the next step is that DSE will submit a formal proposal with financial terms to promote a major WWF show at the Tokyo Dome, which probably won't take place until the latter part of 2000.
WWF was requesting a $1.3 million guarantee for the show.
DSE also talked about putting together a deal which would get the WWF on either weekly, or at least a special, on the Fuji network, which is one of Japan's major networks and would give them equal or better, depending upon what kind of a time slot they can get, TV coverage to All Japan and New Japan. Fuji currently broadcasts the Athena show on women's wrestling about once a month, which has been doing about a 4.0 rating after midnight on Sunday night, which is about a 50 share, so it considered a huge success. The Japanese were concerned because they were doing the deal with the idea of bringing Austin in as the main event. Pritchard told them that by the time the show takes place, which would be the latter part of next year, Austin may be able to wrestle, and even if not, he could make an appearance.
Since Raw is a big cult deal on Japanese satellite TV, the promoters think Austin, the biggest star on Raw, is key to drawing a big house. But don't realize that by the time next year rolls around, not that everyone will have forgotten about Austin for The Rock, but Rock, barring serious injury, will most likely be more important as a draw to those same fans as Austin. The WWF Millennium Show on New Year's Eve from 11 p.m. to midnight will not be a pay-per-view but be a USA Network special. The New Year's Eve pay-per-view, at least on satellite, will be a UFC taped show airing the best fights in UFC history, including Frank Shamrock vs. Tito Ortiz and Mark Coleman vs. Maurice Smith. Some background on ring announcer Lillian Garcia. She was originally from the Carolinas and came to New York about 7 years ago to try and become a star as a singer. She was described as very attractive with a mediocre voice, but she did have a lot of success on the local band level. The description within that world of her by a longtime reader of ours who is a prominent part of that scene sounded like a description WWF wrestlers would say today about Rena Mero. Trish Stratus suffered a sprained ankle in her first week of WWF training. WWF announced the hiring of Jonathan Coachman, a sportscaster from KMBC in Kansas City, as the new member of its broadcast team and said he'd be starting as a regular on January 3rd. Tim Russert of Meet the Press was heavily ripped in our local media for a WWF question on the December 5th show to Jesse Ventura. Russert asked if the WWF should tone down its product based on such a high percentage of the audience being young children. Ventura, who was also heavily ripped, gave as his answer that's the job of parents. Jim Dunbar of KGO Radio, who is a member of the Broadcasting Hall of Fame, said Ventura's response was the epitome of a politician weaseling his way out of giving an answer, but said that's the kind of thing politicians do. But for Russert not to ask the obvious follow-up questions and let Ventura get away with such an answer that avoids the entire question was something well below the standards expected of Russert. Phil Mushnick in the December 6 New York Post ripped on the Channel 9 news team for filling its newscast with WWF puff pieces to capitalize on keeping the SmackDown audience. The Los Angeles UPN station, KCOP, also has a directive that there has to be a WWF story on every Thursday newscast. He noted the November 30th show, which came after the UPN Tuesday night special, had 2 stories: theater critic quizzing WWF stars as to who their favorite movie star was, and investigative reporter Matt Schwartz doing a "Where Are They Now?" piece on Tito Santana. Mushnick also noted that virtually every station in the market reported on the story about advertisers pulling out of SmackDown that very evening, but the UPN station ran 2 wrestling stories and never mentioned it. Mushnick also noted how UPN President Dean Valentine had declared before the TV season started that WWF is incredibly mild entertainment, retorting, "Yeah, so incredibly mild that advertisers have pulled out despite enormous ratings." The Royal Rumble in Madison Square Garden sold out the first day tickets were put on sale, which isn't that big a surprise. The February 14th Raw show at the San Jose Arena sold out in 2 hours, and the February 29th SmackDown taping in Trenton, New Jersey sold 10,000 tickets in 41 minutes. House shows over the weekend saw the 9th consecutive sellout at Madison Square Garden on December 4th drew 16,510 paying $444,039, and Split Cruise, as opposed to the same crew doing double shots, on December 5th in Hartford, Connecticut drew 7,066 paying $213,066, and December 5th in Albany, New York drew 8,147 paying $207,699.
For the house shows from December 4th through Raw on December 6th, they did $244,608 or $5.78 per head. Highlights of the MSG show were Big Show over Triple H in the title match. The tag title match which went on last had Outlaws over Rock and Mankind via DQ when Rock and Mankind had the match won, but Snow interfered and attacked the Outlaws, costing Rock and Mankind the match, and an angle where after Hardys and Chyna beat Jericho and Too Cool, that Jericho turned on Too Cool until Ricochet made the save for them and all three danced in the ring. Bear and Stearns on December 1st came out with a study of WWF stock claiming based on the recently released quarterly report that it should trade at $32 as compared to what it is right now. TV advertising was up 30% from the same period last year, largely due to increase in Raw ratings and more because of SmackDown debuting. WWF took in $13.4 million for the quarter in TV ad revenue. Pay-per-view revenue increased for the quarter from last year, as did live event revenue, largely from a slight increase in attendance and a higher average ticket price, $27 as opposed to $21 from last year. Licensing and advertising increased $7.5 million over the quarter to $27.4 million due to strong toy and video game sales. Per capita spending on merchandise was flat, so the company is planning to revamp the arena merchandise line, and home video sales were up 15%. Sean Stepich, was fired at the December 6 tapings in Worcester, Massachusetts by Ross in front of everyone. Apparently Stasiak has secretly kept a tape recorder in his bag and would tape while he was gone to hear what people were saying behind his back, and was also allegedly tape recording locker room and road conversations, and had gotten caught. The issue had been addressed and appeared to have blown over, but McMahon made the decision on December 6 to fire him. There was some concern among the wrestlers of what he had allegedly recorded and when he started doing so, since nobody really knew. Since Wrestling with Shadows, that secret taping in the dressing room isn't something the company looks fondly on. Whether it's the clash of titans in the ring or the drama that unfolds outside it, we're here to break it down, match by match, feud by feud. Remember, in the world of wrestling, every day is a battle, and every victory is a story waiting to be told. Until next time, keep the passion alive, and never stop wrestling with the possibilities. This is the Pro Wrestle Machine,